Zombie Dawn Apocalypse of the Zombie Dawn Trilogy. Written by Michael G. Thomas and Nick S. Thomas. Narrated by Mark Diamond. Chapter 1. The March, United Kingdom. Nick and Carter crept over the ridge that ran along the high riverbank. Behind them was the churning River Wye, thick with the recent heavy rains that also added a muddy color to the surface. A narrow bridge crossed the river to the small medieval town of Chepstow. It was all that was left of the Green Zone, the area set up 10 years ago as a stronghold in the zombie apocalypse. The town still retained parts of its ancient city walls, as well as a largely intact castle running along the cliffs. Though its size was much reduced, it was well defended by the river on one side that was flanked by steep cliffs on the other, by the rebuilt and reinforced medieval town walls that stood 20 feet tall and were made of thick stone and masonry. Nick had been fighting since the first days of the outbreak, and it seemed like the fight had never stopped. From his escape in the early hours, he had eventually taken over as leader of the scouting and combat sections of the Green Zone. His expertise in close-quarter combat and the group of vehicles he'd organized had saved scores of people. To his side lay Carter, a survivor that he'd rescued years ago when being held as prisoner by a motorcycle gang. In the following years, he'd grown into a successful hunter and had proven a valuable fighter and scout. Both men wore a bizarre collection of clothing and equipment that made them look like a cross between an Arctic explorer and a refugee. Their clothes were dull and repaired many times. They wore heavy boots and reinforced gloves, and their arms and legs were protected by additional sections of armor made from pieces of car rubber. They also wore loose-fitting bands around their necks to protect against throat bites. After 10 years, their equipment had changed to emphasize limb and neck protection, whereas most rookies protected the torso first. Carter carried a medium-sized crossbow on his back, along with a quiver containing scores of bolts. On his belt was a stag-handled machete, as big as his arm. Nick, on the other hand, still carried his folding crossbow on one side and his prized Glock 17 pistol that had been recovered a few years back from the bodies of 4 long-dead policemen, presumably part of an armed response team. On his leg he carried a machete that was very similar to the one carried by Carter. The last piece of equipment, though, was his Bible chopper, a weapon that was based on a medieval falchion, a single-edged sword, with a thick blade and a series of spikes running down the back of the tip. It looked like a weapon that most people would expect to be carried by a villain in a fantasy film. Incredibly, though, it was based on designs from an illustrated medieval Bible. He'd picked it up before the outbreak, when on holiday in Sweden. Nick looked back, spotting the town and its large castle behind him with its tattered flags still flying. He scanned the outskirts of town with his binoculars, checking for any potential problems. It was a trip that he did every day to ensure the safety of this last enclave in Britain. As far as they knew, this was the only inhabited area left on the mainland. Not that it mattered, though. They weren't going anywhere. "Looks clear," said Carter. "Yeah," replied Nick, as he continued panning across the horizon. At least half of the town had been demolished in the last few years, mainly to fill many gaps in the town walls, and also to help build new sections where the old wall no longer existed. The original walls ran through the modern town, so the buildings near it had been flattened, with the end result that the town of Chepstow was now only a quarter the size that it used to be. The benefits were less space to defend, stronger defenses, and also more flattened space to use for industry and farming for the 212 inhabitants still remaining. The only ways to safely cross the river was to use the narrow, long steel bridge that ran cliff top to cliff top, or a much smaller bridge that was also barricaded near the castle. The main bridge was a modern structure designed for trucks and cars, but for years now had been barricaded at both ends. It was the only way in from the east, and pointed like an arrow into the heart of town. Through his binoculars, Nick could see the 4 guards that were always on duty guarding the bridge. He looked back at the ridge that lay ahead. The ridge was both the outer limit of their community and also marked the old borderline between the lands of Wales and England, a division that was now just a name, an irrelevance to both the living and the undead. Nick lifted himself up and moved forward with Carter moving off at his side. As they reached the ridge, they looked down to the old, widely spaced out suburbs of Tutshill. This area was now abandoned, and much of it had been burnt in the various purging campaigns conducted by the defenders. Until 3 years ago it was still occupied, but growing pressure from the horde had pushed them back over the ridge and behind the safety of the river. Carter pointed out into the distance. "Can you see that?" he said. Nick looked carefully with his binoculars, always impressed with Carter's keen eyesight. He looked out to the edge of the housing areas, to the open space ahead. At first, he couldn't see anything unusual. He looked to the left, and then spotted them. A group of people lurking near the abandoned trucks. "Oh yeah, I've got them," he said as he stared intently. The group seemed to be about a dozen strong, and they were moving around the long abandoned vehicles from one of the battles years ago. Nick cradled the binoculars to reduce the shake so he could examine them more carefully. "Are they survivors?" asked Carter. "I can't tell yet. They're too far away," he replied. The 2 men continued examining the area for any other signs, but the group was the only change on the landscape they'd seen in weeks. "We need to get closer," said Nick as he turned back down the ridge to the road. Carter followed him until they reached the road that ran up to the barricades on the ridge. He walked alongside Nick. "You thinking of getting the quad out?" he asked. "I don't like using it. Fuel is nearly gone as it is. But we need to know what's going on," he said as he approached the guards. The doorway slid open to reveal a mass of crates and tools that had been salvaged and stored on the bridge. One of the guards dropped down. He was called Tony, and was one of the group they'd picked up in the shopping center. He was opinionated and had been a real irritant, but over the years had mellowed. "Found something?" he asked suspiciously. "Maybe. I need the quad," said Nick. "Must be serious. You want it now?" he asked. Nick nodded whilst turning to Carter. "If they're survivors, we'll need an extraction unit to help us get them in," he said. Carter moved inside and picked up the wired intercom. Before he spoke, though, he turned back, looking a little confused. "What if they aren't?" "Simple. We put them down. All of them," said Nick with a grin. Tony reappeared, pushing a large quad from out of an awning, where 2 more appeared in various states of repair. The quad was one of the larger all-terrain vehicles, and it had been slightly modified, with racks for equipment and an enlarged rear seat, so 2 could travel with equipment more comfortably. "How much fuel do you need?" asked Tony. "Enough for an hour, no more," he replied. Tony returned to the other 2 vehicles and unlocked a large metal storage bin. He returned with a green plastic container containing several liters of the precious fuel. He unscrewed the cap and proceeded to fill the tank. Nick walked over to the shelter on the bridge, where several storage lockers were placed. He opened the first to reveal a selection of weapons. The weapons were positioned at this end of the bridge for 2 reasons, the first being a handy location to rearm in case of attack on the bridge. The second was to rearm scouting units when the occasion demanded it. Due to the lack of supplies and the ability to remake ammunition, it had become harder to make use of firearms, so those that remained were kept in the best possible condition and close by. Of the 6 guns in the locker, 4 were shotguns taken from local farms. There was also a small caliber target or hunting rifle that was useful for a variety of jobs. The weapon that Nick took, though, was one of the bolt-action rifles taken from the shooting range. It was an Enfield rifle, originally a No. 4 weapon, that had probably seen action in World War II. In later years, it had been stripped down and rechambered for the standard NATO 7.62mm bullets, and outfitted with a telescopic sight. It made for a powerful and accurate rifle, perfect for the zombie apocalypse. The only real problem was the shortage of bullets. Though their raids a year ago into the towns in Wales had produced a small quantity of ammunition from the police stations and army barracks. "There, you're ready," said Tony as he hit the start button on the quad. With just a couple of squeaks, the engine kicked and then started. "Great work, Tony. You're keeping him running well," he said. Tony nodded in acknowledgement before turning back inside the barricade. Carter came out and jogged over, jumping onto the back of the quad. In his hand he carried a flare gun from the stores. "Okay, I've let them know what we're doing. If we need help with the survivors, we do the usual flare in the air. If we hit trouble," he said before being interrupted by Nick. "If we hit trouble, they'll know from the gunfire," said Nick dispassionately. Nick revved the engine, double-checking it was all running as it should. "Good luck," shouted Tony from the barricade. Nick lifted his arm up, waving as he powered the quad and drove off along the road. With the road being of no importance anymore, it had been reclaimed by weeds and rubbish over the years, so that it was impassable to a normal car. Not that any of those were still running. The quad bumped over the rougher road until they reached the crest in the road that looked down into the suburbs. Due to the sunken nature of the road, it was impossible to see out to the abandoned trucks. Nick kept moving at a steady pace, whilst Carter hung over to his side, keeping a constant vigil. Their training, equipment, and experience had kept them alive so far, and they weren't about to wander into trouble without knowing exactly what was happening. They were now past the first burnt houses, and picking their way through shopping trolleys, ransacked cases, and the occasional wrecked car. This was the dangerous bit, as anybody could be lurking behind debris of that size. Almost holding their breath in anticipation, they moved past the houses and into the main street. Nick knew the route well, and worked out in his head how far they needed to travel to get a view of the trucks. "Once we get past the building, over there, we should be able to see the trucks," he said to Carter. They continued through the street, avoiding the largest debris and over the rest where it was unavoidable. As they rounded the corner, they reached the building Nick had pointed out. It was an old local supermarket, though it was now a ruinous mess. There was a small car parking area that was empty next to it, and Nick moved there and stopped. He jumped off the quad, and Carter followed, moving to the front. He was about to cut the engine, when Nick lifted his hand. "No, don't cut the engine. We don't want to be messing with that if we hit trouble," he said. "Yeah, of course," he replied, feeling stupid for even thinking about it. The 2 men moved a short distance away from the quad, so they could get a clear look out into the distance and towards the trucks. The view was partially obstructed by trees and a wrecked house, but they could just about make out 2 of the trucks, and the people were much more visible. "There, I can see them," said Nick as he pulled out his binoculars. Looking carefully, he had a good view of the first truck. It was a delivery lorry for one of the supermarkets. One of the wheels was missing, and the back section was black and burnt. As he moved to the right, a dark shape appeared. He refocused before realizing it was one of the people. Lifting upwards, he spotted another one moving near the door of the truck as they tried to open it. He looked carefully. Their clothes were ripped and damaged, but looked recent. All the zombies they'd seen in the last year were either naked or in the bare remnants of rags. The closest person turned and finally gave him the view he really didn't want to see. "Fuck," swore Nick as he lowered his binoculars. "Zombies?" asked Carter, though not really appearing surprised. Nick looked back into his binoculars, studying them more carefully. "Yeah, they look recent, as in really recent. They must have been trying to get here when they were caught. Wait, holy shit," he cried. "What is it?" Nick handed the binoculars over to him whilst he stood there silent. Carter lifted them and examined the scene in detail. He had to force himself not to take a step back when he spotted the people in view. One of them was holding onto the truck whilst swinging a weapon of some kind. It looked like a baseball bat. Next to this person were two more, both in tattered clothing, stumbling away, presumably having been hit by the weapon. "Is that a survivor?" There was no reply. He turned to find Nick already sitting on the quad. "Get on! We need to get over there!" he shouted. With just a few steps, Carter was on the back and the quad raced past the building and out onto the roads towards the trucks. As they bounced over the debris, Carter pulled one of the shotguns from the mount on the side of the quad. It was a standard double-barreled weapon, but its barrels had been cut down to make it easier to use from the quad. He pulled the lever and snapped the barrels down to reveal the empty chambers. From his pocket he pulled out two of the custom shells and slid them in. He snapped the barrels shut, and the weapon was ready to go. They rounded another corner to reveal the trucks about 200 yards ahead. From their position, they could see a dozen people, of which 2 or 3 looked alive and were busy fighting the undead. Nick gunned the engine, and they raced in as fast as possible. As they approached, 2 of the zombies knocked one of the people to the ground, and they both went down to try and bite their victim. Nick plowed the quad directly into the 2 zombies. The first was knocked aside, and the second was thrown in front of the vehicle. Without hesitating, Nick leapt off the quad and pulled out his Bible basher. With a mighty slash, he brought it down hard onto the pinned zombie's head, easily splitting it open. A wail from behind indicated the second one was trying to lift itself up. He ran over to the creature and delivered a horizontal cut that connected with the neck and removed the head cleanly. In just 2 cuts, he had destroyed the first 2 monsters. Carter jumped off the back of the quad and advanced to the second truck, where 2 more people were fighting with improvised weapons. To his left, a woman swung a machete, whilst next to her a man swung an axe, narrowly missing a zombie and ending up embedding it in the door of the truck. Carter moved to the side and put 2 shots into the attackers. The power of the blast was substantial, and the modified shot blasted the 2 creatures apart. He turned to the 2 to see their surprised and horrified expressions. "Carter! I'm Carter!" he said, as he moved forward to check for more survivors. The 3 survivors simply stood, obviously exhausted and unable to speak. Nick moved over, looking at the bodies and the 3 people. "Is anybody hurt?" he asked. "Anybody bitten?" They shook their heads, though Nick wasn't convinced. That's what they always said. The woman tried to speak, but her muttering was unintelligible. "What?" asked Nick, straining to hear her. A wail announced the arrival of another 4 zombies as they climbed over the burnt-out trucks. Nick jumped in front, swinging his blade whilst Carter quickly reloaded his shotgun. Before he could shoot, Nick had already taken the arm off the first and embedded the spiked back edge into the second. "Out of the way!" shouted Carter. Nick rolled to the side as he blasted the remaining two zombies with both barrels. The surviving one-armed zombie staggered forward, only to be met by the raged woman, who slashed it from neck to shoulder with her machete. The bloody body collapsed into a mushy mound on the ground. The woman cleared her throat, coughing, and tried to speak again. "They're coming," she said, pointing out to the east. "Lots of them." Nick moved around the crashed trucks to look out into the distance. At first he could see nothing, just the road, horizon, and the sky. Then he realized the haze on the horizon wasn't a haze. It was the Horde, and their numbers looked limitless. Carter joined him and examined them in the binoculars. "Holy Mother of God! There must be hundreds! No, thousands of them!" Nick turned to the group. "Come on. We need to get back to warn the others. They could be at the town in a day. Maybe less." Chapter 2. Lundy Island, England. The cool wind blew across Dave's face as he walked along the hilltops beside the island's harbor, taking in the fresh air. He walked past the graveyard where much of the island's population had been buried years before. The wooden crosses over the graves now weathered and pale. Of the 30 people who were on Lundy Island when the outbreak began, only 8 managed to survive the first year. Many people in a panic piled aboard the tourist ferry from Ilfracombe, some already infected. Within a week, the island was once again free of the infection, but with only 6 of its inhabitants alive, and 2 tourists. Dave had been on this island for 7 years now. Roger and his fellow survivors had attempted to set up another community, but with even fewer survivors and resources, it had been a disaster just as the first. Soon after, they had hit the road and never stopped, until they were finally sick of the nomadic lifestyle and forever running low on fuel. Roger led the group to the island of Lundy, taking just a small sailboat and what supplies they had left. Roger's group consisted of Dave, Tommy, Sandra, and Graham, as well as Kelly and Travis, who they had picked up the year before. Graham had since died of a heart attack. Tommy and Sandra had a son not long after arriving on the island, and another 2 of the people now on the island had a son born just a few months before. The total population stood as a miserly 16 people, a tiny community hanging on to its existence. The island was 3 miles long by less than a mile wide, but it provided shelter and food for those who inhabited it. The community spent most of their time farming the small amount of land they needed to, and fishing for food on the coastline. It was a peaceful life and free of the stress and threats they had previously known. "Dave!" shouted Tommy. He looked around to see Tommy and his son Ryan walking up the path towards him. Seeing people walk casually in the countryside without weapons and armor was a sight he still found odd, and yet extremely satisfying after the years they had spent in the confines of their bases and protective equipment. "Hey, Tommy. Ryan, what's up?" "It's a nice day." "Ryan fancies a swim. Feel like joining us?" asked Tommy. They carried on down to the beach, and within 10 minutes were in the sea. The water was cold, but none of them cared. The freedom that their island afforded them made so many other worries seem insignificant. Dave turned to look out to sea, and could see the glimmer of a boat a few miles out. "Hey! Check it out!" shouted Dave. "Looks like a fair-sized boat, Dave," Tommy said. Let's get back and see if we can't get them on the radio. They rushed back to the house. It was pretty rare these days that they saw anything at sea. Every year or two, a vessel had come across them and managed to do trade, and it was always nice to see new faces. "Hey, Roger, there's a boat a few miles out," said Dave. "All right, let's see if we can reach them." Their leader sat down at the console table where the radio was set up. "This is the island of Lundy. You are a few miles from our coast. Please acknowledge," said Roger. There was no response for a minute. "Maybe it's a ghost ship," said Tommy. "I repeat, this is Lundy Island. Please respond," said Roger. "This is the vessel Morning Star. Over," said the operator. "What's your name, son?" asked Roger. "Malcolm. Over," said the operator. "Hi, Malcolm. We're a zombie-free island with produce to trade and company to share. You're most welcome to bring your boat in." "Thank you. We'll see you shortly. Over," said Malcolm. Roger put the radio down. He turned to his friends. "Right. Now remember, these are not guaranteed friendlies, just because they are living. They could be opportunists or madmen." "But they're just survivors like us," said Tommy. "Think back to before the outbreak. Were people always friendly to you all the time? Did crime not exist? Was life always fair? No. What we have on this island is priceless, and I'm sure there are still people in this world that would kill to get it. Now, I hope they will be civil and trade some useful supplies. But let's be prepared for any eventuality," said Roger. "He's right, Tommy. We can't assume anything. There's too much at stake," said Dave. "All right. They have no idea how many of us there are. I want you two, Travis and Jones, to arm yourselves and hold up here. Steve and Giles will meet the boat with me at the jetty. Everyone else is to grab what weapons they have and stay safely inside the tavern. Okay?" asked Roger. "Sure, I'll get the word around," said Tommy. "Do it quickly. I'll get some weapons ready," said Dave. "Good. I'm sure this will be a pleasant encounter, but let's keep our heads and be smart," Roger added. A couple of hours later, the boat was pulling into the jetty. A 50-meter luxury sail yacht. There were 5 men on deck, all with weapons slung on them, a few handguns and machetes. Roger did not like the sight of well-armed strangers, but he could hardly blame them. The world outside their isolated island was a bleak and dangerous one. Roger carried his saber on a belt, with Chris and Giles having tool belts with hammers slung on them. This kept them armed without looking too threatening. Lines were thrown over from the boat, and Giles and Steve lashed them down. A man stepped off onto the jetty with a grin on his face, approaching Roger. "Malcolm?" asked Roger. "Yep. You in charge of this place?" asked Malcolm. "I am indeed, and you are most welcome." The man continued onwards towards Roger and offered his hand out in a gesture of goodwill. Roger took the man's hand, but Malcolm twisted his arm around his back and kicked the back of his knees out, sending him down. Before Steve and Giles could react, there was a handgun touching Roger's head. "Don't even think about it," said Malcolm. "What the fuck are you doing?" asked Giles. Malcolm turned and trained his pistol on Giles, quickly pulling the trigger. The bullet penetrated the man's heart, and he collapsed onto the ground, dying almost instantly. "No! We'll give you what you want," shouted Roger. "I know you will," said Malcolm. "Okay, just take it easy. No one else has to get hurt here," said Roger. "It's fucking amazing that you bunch of idiots have survived this long." said Malcolm. Why? Because we're decent folk? Asked Steve. No, because you're all so stupid. Who the hell greets strangers with open arms in these times? This is about survival of the fittest, shouted Malcolm. How can you treat human life with such little regard? Asked Steve. I take care of me and my own. Otherwise, we just end up victims like you. Only if scums like you exist to take advantage, said Steve. Welcome to the real world. Now shut the fuck up, shouted Malcolm. Leave it, Steve, said Roger. That's right. Listen to the boss. What do you want? Asked Roger. Firstly, take that sword off, carefully, and that hammer on your friend, said Malcolm. The two men removed their weapons and laid them down on the dock. Right. Now what have you got in this place? Clearly no decent weapons. Food? Water? Alcohol? Asked Malcolm. Yes, all of that, and plenty of it, said Roger. Now we're talking. Where? A large amount of it is in my house. It's a 10-minute walk from here, said Roger. All right, lads. You three with me. Grab some bags. Tell the others to stay here and keep an eye on things, shouted Malcolm. 2 minutes later, they were already making their way up the hill towards Millcombe House. How many of you are there on this island? Asked Malcolm. 6. The other 3 are fishing on the west side of the island, said Roger. Good. Then we'll be left in peace. Yes. We aren't fighters, just survivors. We just want to live. And you will, once you've given us what you have to give. And what will we eat when you've taken our food? Asked Roger. I'm sure you can grow more, or go find some on the mainland. Right now, your only concern is making it through the day, said Malcolm. The group of 6 reached the house, Malcolm's men with their weapons in hand, and leading the 2 islanders. Posh place. You've got style, I'll give you that, said Malcolm. They reached the front door, and Roger led them inside with a gun to his back. They reached the kitchen, and Malcolm looked up at the supplies, already visible. Right. I'll watch these 2. Lads, load up. The 3 scumbags roared with excitement at the booty they were able to take without a fight. They began stuffing their large packs with everything edible in sight. You got any other grub in this place? We keep a store. It's down that corridor, last door on the right, said Roger. Leon, get on it, shouted Malcolm. Malcolm's henchman ran enthusiastically out of the room towards the stores. He opened the door and stepped through, his eyes glistening as he looked at the canned food piled high. Holy shit, boss! It's a gold mine! Shouted Leon. He stepped into the room. A flicker of movement caught his attention as he turned to the side, but it was too late. A club hammer crashed down on his head, sending him lifeless, crumpling to the floor. Malcolm appeared in the doorway and immediately noticed the body of his comrade. He looked back up, peering down the body of a crossbow. The string released and the bolt soared through his clothing and into his lung. He stumbled back out of the room with his back against the far wall. He tried to lift his pistol, but Dave leapt out of the room and took hold of his arm as the handgun let off a round. The club hammer once again descended onto his skull. Malcolm collapsed to the ground. The other 2 henchmen had already begun to head towards the sound of the gunshot and were running down the corridor. The arrow of a bow pierced the back of the man at the back. He turned to respond, but Steve slung another arrow and released it, hitting his chest squarely, and the man collapsed. Dave picked up Malcolm's handgun, a Browning high power. and immediately brought it to bear against the last assailant, firing 3 shots before he could lift his gun. Roger arrived in front of the bodies, looking at Dave with both shock and relief. "Right. Good job. Now, we have no idea how many more of them there are down on that boat. It's entirely possible they will have heard those shots and come running, so let's assume we have just 5 minutes to get fully prepared," said Roger. "What do you want us to do?" asked Tommy as he rushed in. "They will be expecting a fight, so let's make use of our defensive position. The walls are nice and thick here, and it will be their first port of call coming up the hill. Steve, Jones, Travis, you're with me. We'll defend from the windows of the house. Dave, Tommy, I want you hidden outside behind the side wall. Stay out of sight until the first shot is fired, and then get a crossfire going," said Roger. "Are we really going to kill them all? These are people, not zombies," said Jones. "We have no choice. They killed Giles without a second thought, and we will follow him if we don't fight back. It's them or us. Now, grab plenty of weapons and ammunition, and get ready." 5 minutes later, Dave and Tommy leapt over the wall beside the large old house. They had 2 rifle crossbows each, and a shotgun. All were loaded and propped up ready against the wall. Dave peered out carefully over the wall down the long road that led to the beach. He could already just see the movement of people heading towards them. They had got in position just in time. "Right, Tommy, we stay silent. No firing until we hear the first shot from the house. Use the crossbows first. They don't give away our position. But keep them in hand whilst those bastards walk past, just in case they try and jump us." "All right. You think the others can handle this?" asked Tommy. "They have handled 10 years of survival in a world that few others have. I would say they are as ready as anyone can be. Now, get your head down." It was a tense few minutes as the 2 men listened to the footsteps of their enemies getting closer and closer. They could only hope they went straight for the house. The sounds of the men soon passed as they went beyond Dave's position and into the small rectangular walled garden in front of the house. "Hey, boss, you in there?" shouted one of the thugs. Dave peered over the wall. There were 6 men, 30 feet in front of them. The door was shut, but the windows were all open. He slowly placed the shotgun back against the wall and picked up the first crossbow. As Dave slipped the stock into his shoulder, a blast rang out from one of the lower windows. A burst of flame and smoke hit the lead thug in the chest, knocking him to the ground. The 5 others lifted their weapons to fire. 1 shotgun round had already blasted through an open door when Dave got his crossbow on target. Dave squeezed the trigger of the crossbow, and the bolt released, piercing his target's body at the side, and driving into the chest. Tommy's first bolt struck the next thug in his right arm. He screamed in agony as the handgun in his hand dropped to the ground. The injured man turned to see Dave and Tommy's position, and stumbled to pick the revolver up with his left hand. As he got upright, Tommy's second bolt pierced his chest. Gunshots rang out from inside the house, from the defenders as the thugs fired back in a fight more reminiscent of a Wild West shootout. Dave picked up his shotgun and leapt over the wall, immediately locking the stock into his shoulder. Tommy close behind. 3 of the men were still standing, but a bloody and dirty mess. Dave fired the first shotgun shell, and then the second before the smoke had even cleared, Tommy following suit, and then all was silent. The sour smell of sulfur wafted across the garden in a sea of gunpowder smoke. Dave kept walking, throwing the shotgun to the floor and picking up the revolver from Tommy's victim. He walked past the first body, Blood was already seeping out across the previously perfectly green grass. The heavy bolt of Milcombe House slid across, and the door was pulled open. Dave could already hear the screams of pain from a man inside. Roger stepped out from the building and towards the bodies. 5 of the thugs were already dead from multiple wounds. The last was reeling in agony. Roger picked up a .357 snub-nosed Smith & Wesson from the ground and stepped over the body of the wounded man. He raised the gun to the man's head and fired immediately, the round piercing the near silence of the garden. "Anyone hit?" asked Dave. "Travis took some birdshot in the arm. He needs some help, but he'll live," said Roger. "What a waste of life." "Yes, but at least not our lives," said Roger. "This is a bittersweet victory. This morning we had a population of 16, now just 15, and the knowledge that we have killed a sizable amount of the living population in the world," said Dave. "Yes, it saddens me too, but we did the best we could in a difficult situation. Now, we still don't know if there are any more on that boat. You, Tommy, and Jones head down and check it out. Make sure you're well armed. Steve and I will get some help for Travis," said Roger. "Jones, get out here," shouted Dave. Moments later, the 3 men were taking the walk downhill that their victims had taken just minutes before. It was a depressing and quiet walk, none of them wanting to talk about the miserable deeds that they were required to undertake. They reached the jetty and could see no sign of movement on the boat at all, so began to carefully step towards it, weapons at the ready. They could already see the bloody and still body of their friend at the end of the walkway. It hardened their resolve. Dave took the first step on board, followed by the other 2 men. "Hello? Anyone on board?" Dave peered down the hatch into the cabin, and a man leapt out at the far end of the room, immediately firing a handgun. 2 shots landed either side of Dave in the cabin interior, the man being careless of his aim and recoil. Dave lifted his shotgun quickly and fired, hitting the man dead center in the chest. Tommy and Jones quickly ran into the cabin and past the man's body, searching out the rest of the vessel. "That's it. Nobody left," said Tommy. "Find a sheet for Giles' body and cover him up. Then we'll head to the church before cleaning this shit up," said Dave. The 3 men arrived at the church to find Sandra pulling the pellets out of Travis's arm, a painful exercise, but one he would recover from quite quickly. Roger organized the cleanup later that day, burying their fallen comrade and enemies. It was a solemn day, but one they were all keen to move on from. Chapter 3. Mexico. The 22 survivors of Babylon traipsed on through the heat on their horses, glad of what community they had left. Their fuel had long since run out, the price paid for a nomadic lifestyle. There was not a man or woman amongst them who didn't want to settle down into a new home, but they were all too scared to do so after their loss 9 years ago. All of them feared the unbearable hordes that seemed to ever seek them out, and therefore running was their only option. Madison pulled the shemagh down from her face and lifted her water bottle to her dry lips. She was wearing a close-fitting woman's biker jacket, the zip undone to let some air in. Their group had to be ready for a combat at all times. Leather gloves hung from the cuffs of her jacket, and she wore ski goggles over her eyes to keep out both the sand and any infectious material. She was now in her late 20s, but the hard life showed on her weathered and worn face. Jack rode up and stopped next to her. "You okay?"
"Not really," she replied.
"What is it?"
"All this time we've been fighting to stay alive. But for what? You have to wonder if survival is really the best option when we have to live like this." She sighed.
"What would you have us do? Lay down and die?" asked Jack.
"It wouldn't be so bad, would it? Surely not worse than this. We'd go to heaven, wouldn't we?"
Wells, her father, had been listening, and so rode up to them.
"Not if you let it happen. That would be suicide, and you'd go to hell," he shouted. "Is this not hell already?" Madison asked him. "My dear, not the worst life on earth could ever be comparable to hell," he answered. "We have less than half the people we did 9 years ago. Seems we'll be dead before much longer anyways."
"If that is God's will," said Wells.
"And you think God's will was to wipe out humanity?"
"Perhaps. To punish us for centuries of sin, or to purge out the earth of evil, or to weed out the truly good among us and start afresh."
"That's just crazy talk,"
said Madison. "Madison!" "That's enough," shouted Jack.
"Why? Because the reality of this shit life might hurt someone's feelings?"
Jack rode closer to Madison so he could talk out of earshot of the others. "Yes, the morale of this group hangs by a thread. Just because you're willing to give up, it isn't fair to drag others down with you."
"Maybe it's time they accepted reality."
"And maybe it's time you stopped whining like a little girl and used the time we have left on this planet wisely." They could hear the sound of galloping approaching them, the sound of their point man returning, maybe with urgent news. They all looked up, alert and ready. Justin rode into sight.
"What is it, lad?" asked Wells.
"Zombies! Up ahead!" shouted Justin. "How many?" Jack asked him.
"About a dozen. Could be a handful more."
Jack looked over to Madison. "Perhaps this'll take your mind off things. Nothing like a bit of bloodlust to make one's day," he smiled. Madison sighed, but in all honesty she was relieved to have some excitement after the endless boredom of the last 2 days. She pulled her coat across and zipped it up, pulling her gloves on and placing her shamak back across her face. "Right, people. Time to break some skulls," shouted Jack. Several of them cheered, eager for action. Because they led a nomadic life, they avoided any large populous areas, and so only ever came across small groups of creatures, not wanting to make the same mistake they had 9 years before. They now made it their mission to utterly destroy any group of zombies they came into contact with, providing there were no more than 30 at a time. Armor and gloves were pulled on, machetes and swords drawn, maces and axes pulled from saddles. When they lived in Babylon, they had more guns and ammunition than they ever imagined they would need. But no longer. Ammunition was a rarity that was kept for absolute emergencies only. Every man and woman in the group had carefully selected and planned protective gear, with complete skin coverage and thick leg and arm armor, so they could fight from horseback in safety. Madison drew a long hammer from her saddle and grasped the reins firmly with her left hand. "Everyone ready?" called Jack. The fatigued and dirty people nodded and grunted in agreement. Jack turned his horse around and kicked his heels in, launching himself towards their impending foe.
They got up to pace, heading up a slight incline on the dusty and hard ground. Finally, they reached the top of a ridge and could see beyond. The creatures were scattered in a 30-yard area before them. Without stopping to survey the situation, Jack raised his hatchet and continued onwards to his first target. The troops behind galloped on in a frenzied bloodlust, excited to have a purpose and a task. Jack reached his first victim and slammed the hatchet into the foul-smelling beast's forehead, the blade driving deep into its skull and sticking there. The speed at which Jack had been moving caused the axe to pull from his hand as he rode past, and the zombie dropped to its knees. He slowed down and pulled a two-handed club from his saddle, a steel bar with an iron ball welded onto the tip. The creatures began to flood towards him as he let go of the reins and focused all his attention on the head-splitting mace he now wielded. Lifting the club above his head, Jack swung the big iron ball towards his oncoming target. The weight and trauma of the barbaric tool smashed its skull immediately, and with ease, the force snapping the neck so that the ear rested on its shoulder. Madison reached Jack's side and swung her hammer against her first target. The long-shafted claw hammer was a fast and agile weapon compared to what many of them used, but it still dealt wicked damage when combined with Madison's skill and accuracy. The small metal head of the hammer struck the very top of a zombie's head, the inch-and-a-half tip breaking through the skull. Pulling the hammer from her target, Madison swung horizontally against her next one, smashing the creature in the side of the head and sending it tumbling to her side. It was not quite dead, but its tumbling had sent it directly into the path of Justin's horse that smashed the creature aside as if it had no mass or weight at all, its body finally broken. The nomadic group of living sprawled out across the open plain, riding down every creature with a venomous hatred. In less than 5 minutes, the small horde was a bloody, incapacitated mess in the sand. The living dismounted and walked among their victims, finishing off any that showed signs of movement with one final strike. As the final blows were dealt, their wagon, ridden by Dale, pulled into view. The wagon was their supply train. They used it to haul their food and water, as well as spare weapons and their larger tents. It was an old, rusty, and beaten-up Ford F-250 truck, though barely recognizable as such. The hood, wings, and cab roof had been removed to save weight. The engine and transmission long since ditched. It was barely more than a chassis with a tub with 2 horses rigged to pull it. Wells rode up to Madison as she stamped on the head of a crippled zombie to finish it off. Wells was far from the clean-cut and well-turned-out pastor he used to be. The old pastor would still talk of God throughout most evenings, but even the least observant of the survivors could begin to see his faith dwindling as the years of desperate survival went by. Wells had become battle-hardened, forcibly shrugging off many of his quibbles about violence. "Not a bad haul," he said. "Not that it'll make any difference," she answered him. "But did it not at least make you feel better? More alive?" "Yes, it did that." "Then it made a difference. And tomorrow nothing will have changed. This state of depression and misery is not getting us anywhere. Just because you feel strongly, it doesn't make you right. What you have left is a community, and that is one of the few rarities in life worth treasuring. Think back to before all this began. Think how miserable many people made each other. So many selfish and self-centered individuals divided by envy and petty disputes, living a life of solitude more often through spite than reason. Now we have a group with a unified goal and direction in life, a real community," said Wells. Madison finally stopped her sarcastic and biting riposts and gave some thought to her father's words. She remembered life before the Zompok as perfect, and everything after it as hell. But it was clear that that was not the case. She was finally beginning to realize that without understanding God's plan. The only purpose for the human race was to live life. Jack jumped onto his horse and rode up to Madison and Wells. He was about to speak when his eyes squinted to focus on something in the distance. He pulled out a pair of binoculars from his saddle as Madison and Wells looked around, trying desperately to make it out. Constantly aware of the risks to them in the apocalyptic world they called home. He grinned and handed the binoculars over to Madison. "Looks like we're feasting tonight." She peered through the binoculars and finally panned to what Jack had seen. Her eyes lit up. "A razorback!" shouted Madison. All in earshot turned to look, already imagining the meal they might get that evening. "Maddie, grab a few guys and some weapons and get that animal," shouted Jack. "Fuck yeah!" Madison ran over to the wagon and pulled back the canvas cover. She pulled out a crossbow and a quiver of bolts, kept for hunting purposes only, as no one would risk using bolts that had slain zombies, no matter how much they had been cleaned. "Justin, Riley, get your asses over here," shouted Madison. The two men rode up to the wagon as she drew 2 long spears from their supplies. She handed them to the men. "Take these. Just remember that a razorback can run up the shafts, so let's try and take it down with the crossbow first. You two need to watch my ass." "Happy to watch it all day," said Justin. She turned around with a scowl on her face and walked up to Justin, who was still sitting on his horse. She reached up and grabbed his jacket, wrenching his head down towards her. "Listen, you little bitch. We need that food, and if you fuck this up, we could either go without or get seriously hurt. So get your head out of high school and get into the game," she shouted. She let her grasp go, and with the crossbow in one hand, leapt onto her horse. She rode on towards the razorback, stopping 80 yards short. "Quiet now." The 3 hunters approached the razorback carefully until they were within 50 yards. Madison raised her hand to signal them to stop. She laid the crossbow stirrup on the ground and put her foot through to hold it in place, allowing her to cock the weapon. Raising the rifle crossbow carefully and smoothly, she drew a bolt from the quiver at her side and laid it to rest on the channel. She lowered to one knee and shouldered the weapon, looking down the red dot sight. She took a long, calm breath, held it as she focused her aim until the breath was on the decline, and fired. The bolt soared into the razorback's torso, its body recoiling slightly from the impact. Madison immediately cocked the crossbow again as the frenzied animal began to charge at them. "Do not hesitate!" she shouted. She slid the second bolt onto the crossbow and quickly shouldered it, firing within a split second of it reaching the firing position. The bolt struck into the razorback's shoulder as it was just 15 yards from her, sending it into a tumble. As the wounded animal tried to recover, Riley ran forward and quickly thrust his spear into the animal, until it finally went still. The 3 survivors sighed in relief. "Jesus, I thought zombies were stressful," said Justin. "We just bagged ourselves the evening meal, boys." Riley pulled his blood-covered spear from the animal and looked back at Jack, who was watching impatiently through his binoculars. Riley thrust the spear triumphantly into the air to confirm their success. A few seconds later, a roar of cheering rang out
as Jack passed on the happy news. It was dark now, and the camp lit by several small fires, with the smell of meat cooking wafting around the hungry inhabitants. Riley and Billy had prepared the pig, and it had been cooking on an improvised spit for hours. Madison and Jack sat atop the wagon, whilst Dale, Greg, and Joey were on patrol. The camp had a minimum of 3 men on guard at all times. Each and every man and woman knew that falling asleep could mean death for everyone. Madison was lying flat on the canvas of the wagon, peering up at the beautiful clear sky, whilst Jack sat up watching the fires, the conversation, and the pig. Nighttime was almost always the survivors' favorite time of day, when they could relax and rest, the darkness camouflaging their bedraggled look. At night they could at least have the pretense of a normal life, before the fight for survival began each day. The constant traveling and foraging. "Not so bad, is it?" asked Jack. "What is?" "Life." "It has its moments," said Madison. "And how's that any different to life before the zombies? We still worked crappy day jobs, had family arguments and long journeys. Now we just do the same, but without fast food chains," said Jack. I could kill for a pizza." "You know, a lot of people used to wish for this sort of life, of simplicity, of a basic purpose in life, a driving force," Jack said thoughtfully. "What fucking idiots," Madison replied. "Really? Surely it's instinctive to humans. We didn't start with supermarkets, live news, and fashion stores." "No, but we progressed to it, and now we've stepped backwards," she said. "And yet we used to meet people all the time who regretted so much of their lives, wasted and unfulfilled." Madison sat up, not annoyed to have been interrupted in her stargazing, but more curious as to how the zombie apocalypse could be explained as a positive move for humanity. "You see, we now lead as natural a life as any creature could. Survival of the fittest and all that," Jack continued. "How do you mean?" "Well, surely we are now equal to all creatures on Earth. Without our technology and vast industry, we only have our natural, God-given advantages to survive with," said Jack. "Which are?" "Our brains. How many creatures can use a hammer, an axe, or a gun? We've always been considered top of the food chain. Perhaps it's time we proved it, being as special as we are," said Jack. "Yeah, well, you can see how that went. We tried. We lost. Now we're second in the food chain." "Far from it. We're the predators. They're the prey. Many predators can be taken down when facing superior odds of their prey, but, like for like, we're still on top," said Jack. "Then how do you explain the current apocalypse?" "Survival of the fittest," Jack replied. "Well, not to rain on your parade, but we're quickly getting extinct," said Madison. "Maybe, but we still live as kings, and we'll do it in style," said Jack. Madison giggled. Dale walked casually up to the wagon, a fire axe slung over his shoulder and a machete on his belt as he patrolled. "That's reassuring," he said. "Haven't you got work to do?" Madison asked him. "I'm doing it, can't you see?" He swung the axe down in front of him and clutched it in both hands, looking pleased with himself. "Well, get on with it then," said Jack.
Dale grumbled and threw the axe back up onto his shoulder. "I need to piss anyway," he said. He carried on walking and went 30 yards out from the perimeter of the camp to some bushes, until he found somewhere out of sight. Dale threw his axe down to the ground and unbuttoned his fly, sighing as he relieved himself. He buttoned his jeans back up and turned to pick up his axe, but froze in shock at the sight of a zombie that was standing over his weapon, staggering slowly towards him. Quickly peering around, he realized it was a lone creature, and he relaxed a little. "Fuck me! You scared me, you little bastard!" The creature was only a few paces away, but was moving very slowly as Dale drew his machete from its sheath. "Say hello to my little friend." He took a single step forward and slammed the machete as hard as he could into the beast's skull, splitting it deeply. Blood immediately spurted out, covering Dale's sweater and face. "Aw, man! That's fucking disgusting!" "Hey, Dale, you all right?" Jack called. "All fine, mate." He looked down at his clothing, soaked with a thick, disgusting blood. "God damn, I love this sweater." He put the machete down and pulled the sweater off, throwing it down into a sloppy mess over the dead creature. "Thanks a lot, pal. Just what I needed. Fucking zombies." Blood dripped from his face onto his white t-shirt. He pulled it off and used it to wipe the blood from his face and hands, before finally the blade of his machete. Now bare-chested and at last respectable, he strolled back to the camp to find some replacement clothing. "Food's ready!" shouted Riley. The survivors cheered, the most excitement they had shown all week. Madison and Jack had been sitting silently for the last few minutes, until Jack leapt off the wagon to head to the freshly cooked food. "You coming?" "Nah, I'll wait till the queue dies down," said Madison. "Well, don't wait too long. This is a hungry crowd." Madison sat comfortably watching her friends dig into the well-deserved and welcome meal. The camp was vibrant and beaming with conversation and laughter. It was hard to feel down when there were so many positive waves in the air. Everyone was enjoying themselves as much as the best party she had ever attended before the apocalypse, and they had no alcohol, no fancy clothes, nothing more than a roaring fire and some fresh meat. Words had done nothing to affect Madison's mood, but seeing the community before her hammered the words of Jack and Wells home. Life wasn't all bad. There were probably as many good times as there ever had been. She began to feel annoyed with herself for having such a quitter's attitude, and so publicly. She had assumed life should be good all the time, but perhaps the goal of life was simply to live. Content with her improved outlook on life, and finally eager to join in the fun, Madison leapt from the wagon and strolled over to the pig roast. The evening went on, more like a camping party than an apocalyptic survival camp, with dancing and chatter until all but the guards were asleep. Chapter 4. The March, United Kingdom. Nick and Carter stood in the doorway of the church in the heart of the town. Since the fortification of the town during the zombie outbreak, it had been pressed into service as a hospital. There was something about its thick walls, stained glass windows, and silence that helped instill calm amongst even the most badly injured. Lying on the beds were the survivors brought back by Nick and Carter. One of the medics walked over, whispering quietly. "They're all undernourished, and one has broken ribs. No sign of infection, though. The woman says they were a part of a convoy that tried to get away from Reading," he said. "Reading? I thought we brought the survivors from that outpost here about 12 months ago," said Carter. "The woman says they've been trying to get here for the last month. There were 34 of them when they left. Now just the 3 you found," the medic replied. "Man, that sucks." 2 men entered the church. Both wore thick coats and carried edged weapons on their belts. "Nick, Carter, the council's meeting. Your presence has been requested." Carter looked over to Nick, who didn't appear terribly impressed with the news. "Why? They've heard my report." The first man shrugged. "Let's go," said Nick, as he turned back to the medic. "Thanks for the information. We'll check up on them later." The 4 men walked the short distance from the church to the town's council chambers. They were still being used in much the way they had always been, to talk, argue, and discuss, but rarely to do anything. "We'll be in shortly," said Nick, as he dismissed the 2 men that had come to find them. He turned back to Carter. "These things are always screw-ups in politics. Let me do the talking, and keep calm, okay?" Carter simply nodded in agreement. The 2 approached the doors that opened as though they were automatic. They stepped inside, noticing the men holding the doors open. Inside the small building were around 24 people in a semicircle, listening to information from another of the scouts. "Ah, welcome, Commander," said Davies, a short, bald man who stood on the far side. The rest of the room went quiet as Nick and Carter moved inside. The short man beckoned for them to take the podium where everybody could see them. As they moved into position, the man continued. "We have read your report, Commander, and have grave concerns about our ability to repel such a substantial number of attackers. Our scouting parties to the east have established the main roads are still populated by small numbers of the dead, and the main cities of Newport and possibly Cardiff are massively overrun. What is your assessment of the situation?" he asked. Nick looked to Carter, who nodded, indicating he should speak. Nick took a step forward, addressing the group. "Council members, I have been with this outpost now for nearly 10 years. When I first joined, we controlled most of this region, along with the outlying villages and even some of the castles. Each year our territory and numbers have fallen, while the numbers of our enemies grow stronger. The creatures we found are, in my opinion, the single greatest threat we have ever faced since the razing of the cities 9 years ago. The west side is, as you know, strongly protected by the river and cliff. Providing we protect the bridge, we are safe. The east, however, is an entirely different matter," he said, before being interrupted by Davies. "So, we need to leave then?" "No, I didn't say that. Some tried to leave last year, and we found their bodies a week later when they came back as the dead." "But what about the signals from Fishguard? Why don't we pack up and travel there?" he asked. "I just told you why. The roads are impassable, and it would sacrifice all we have left on a fool's errand. The signals have been the same repeated message for over a year now. There is no guarantee there's anybody alive. Carter and I examined our perimeter and our defenses in detail. We need 24 hours to ensure this town is defensible against a major attack, and we will need the entire population to work on it." "What if we can't hold them?" asked a woman at the back of the room. "If we fail, then we have the emergency boats. But they can only carry a dozen at most. Realistically, we're boxed in, and we don't have the resources to escape in any numbers."
"A dozen? I thought we had plenty of boats. When we first came here, all the boats in the area were tied up for emergency use," asked another in the group.
"You are of course correct. We did, but Mr. Davies decided that upkeep was too much, and we needed to put our time into setting up the council chambers and market. Remember?" he answered accusingly. A murmur spread around the people as they felt the pangs of fear and doubt regarding their situation. Carter moved up to Nick and whispered in his ear,
"The council's going to screw us. You know that, right?"
Nick nodded in agreement, turning back. Before he could speak, an older-looking man stood and addressed the crowd. "So, this seems pretty straightforward to me. We have 3 choices, and we need to choose one of them before they get here. The first is we get every last land vehicle and evacuate to Fishguard. The second is we stand and fight them. And the third is to leave by boat." "Why shouldn't we get the vehicles and make a break for it before the horde arrives? It's probably safer there," asked one of the men.
"Are you not listening?"
Carter asked. "Look, the boats are no good. We have too many people. The land escape is dangerous, and we could get to Fishguard and find it either empty or overrun. Either way, it would mean the end for us. I say we stand and fight," said Nick. At the back of the room, a man in his 30s approached. It was Artur, an old friend of Nick's from the early days of the outbreak. "I agree with Nick. We've stopped them before, and we can stop them again. We have strong walls, supplies, and weapons. If we can't beat them here, then we're fucked." Davies raised his hand. "I have heard all you have to say. Let us deliberate for a while. We will inform you of our decision shortly," he said as he dismissed Nick and Carter. The 2 stepped down and marched to the door. Artur joined them as they left the building. "What's the plan?" asked Artur. They stood silent for a moment whilst they considered the situation. "Okay, we need to put the defense plan into action. We put our militia forces on the perimeter, the most experienced in the center with the mobile reserve. How are the weapons and ammunition?" asked Nick.
"Weapons are okay. We have 14 shotguns and rifles in working order, as well as 2 of the Bren guns from the convoy. As for ammunition, we have lots of our own manufactured shells, but the rifle bullets are no good," Carter explained.
"Yeah, I thought as much. How about the improvised weapons?" asked Nick.
"Well, we've had mixed results on them, as you know,"
answered Carter. "Yeah, I do. Just give me the numbers." Carter looked a little flustered as he fumbled in his jacket. He fished out a small leather notebook, the one he recorded all the defense details in. He turned a few pages and ran his fingers down a column.
"Okay, we have a total of 34 crossbows and 18 muskets, plus another 50 of the improvised hook guns."
The hook guns were crude handguns reminiscent of the 15th century handguns and were basically a piece of scaffold pole with the open end blocked off and a basic wooden tiller fitted to the rest under the arm or on the shoulder. In their tests, they had been very inaccurate, but when loaded with ball bearings from the factory, they acted like giant, powerful shotguns. "You want to use those things?" muttered Artur. "They're not pretty, and their accuracy sucks, but at close range, they do the job," said Nick. Before they could get any further, the door to the council building opened, and 3 people came out, followed by Davies. From what Nick could see, he didn't look pleased, not by a long shot. The oldest of the group stepped forward.
"We have voted and decided the defense of the town is of paramount importance. We also want the boats readied in case things go badly. We suggest no more than 6 people work on the boats to get as many ready as possible. Every other resource is yours, Commander."
Nick nodded to them and then turned back to Artur and Carter. "You know the drill. We've practiced it often enough. Artur, get everybody here. It's time to get started. Carter, you're on kit check. I want everything double-checked and the list updated. I need to know exactly what we have and where in the next hour." Nick turned back to the small group outside the door. "I'm going to need everybody, young or old, weak or strong. If we're to hold the town, we must use every resource." "You're in charge, Commander," said Davies, with a hint of a threat in his tone. "Yes," said Nick. "I'm in charge." It was the middle of the night, and a light mist drifted down the river past the town. Though the town was a hive of activity, most of it couldn't be seen from Nick's vantage point on Tuts Hill, directly across the river. It was only a short distance from where Nick and Carter had first spotted the people in the distance. He stood atop a ruined house that now acted as an observation point. Carter stood nearby, drinking from a flask. "Well, at least the gear's in good shape." "Yeah, though I'm still not sure on that swivel gun you found," said Nick with a grin. Carter feigned hurt. "Why not? The reenactor that brought it here used to use it for displays. I know we haven't tested it loaded yet, but it looks well made." The 2 men looked back to the distance, straining their eyes to spot any signs of the undead. It was a pointless exercise, though. With the fog and the low light, the visibility was so poor a zombie could probably reach the hill without being spotted. "You know, we can always try the diversion plan. It's risky, but there's a chance it could work," said Carter. "Yeah, I've been thinking about that. Trouble is, the last time we tried it, the zombies were pulled away. But after a day, they were back on our trail." "True, but wouldn't an extra day give us an even better chance of winning here?" asked Carter. "Interesting," Nick replied. "Show me the map." Nick examined it carefully, making a mental note of the red markings that indicated people and equipment. "Give me the status of preparations." "Well, in the last 6 hours, we've repaired the walls so that we have a complete breach-free perimeter. Arthur has split everybody into shifts, as in the plan, and they're cleaning and testing all the weapons. Gary is getting the mobile reserve ready, along with Zach and the Johnson brothers." "That's good. What's the situation with the fighters? What's the total?" asked Nick. "Out of our 212, we have 174 capable of fighting. The rest are either injured, sick, or working in the hospital. Out of those, we have 20 trained close-quarter specialists, and the rest have varying amounts of training and expertise. It's critical that we keep the mobile reserves in the center. The area in the front of the castle is best as it gives quick access to the rest of the town. Get the quads and motorcycles there as well. In that way, we can respond to the problems quickly," ordered Nick. "What about the other 150-odd?" asked Carter. "I want them split into groups of 30. That will give us 5 units of 30 men, with 1 at each of the bridges. 2 on the walls, and 1 in the reserve at the castle," said Nick.
You sure you want to keep that many in the castle? He asked. Definitely. That'll give us about 50 people in reserve. Don't forget the mobile reserve can only be in one place at a time. Once we plug the gaps, we'll use the group in the castle to replace the losses. Carter nodded in agreement. Come on, we need to get back. By my calculations, the first of them could be here by daybreak, said Nick. Nick stood in the open ground in front of the castle. The sunlight burned through the fog to create a cool but clear view of the town. The mobile reserve stood waiting with their armor fitted and their weapons at the ready. It was an odd collection of people, each of them wearing different equipment, ranging from Jake in his full harness of medieval armor through to the policeman Gary in his riot armor. One thing they all had in common was their experience in fighting the undead. The first of the dead will be at the bridges in the morning. We're well prepared and equipped, but it's our job, he pointed at the group, to plug the gaps and provide help where it is needed. You're in 2 groups. The first, as usual, will be led by Gary. The second, by Tony, Nick said. Nick turned and pointed to the 4 corners of the town. Each of the zones is equipped with flares as per the plan. They are to be used in emergencies only. A green flare will be fired to indicate help is needed immediately. You are to respond to a help request 1 group at a time. I do not want all our reserves in one place. When you have finished, use a red flare if you need the castle reserves to replace the casualties. Any flares from the castle will indicate a general retreat to the castle. If this happens, don't mess around. Grab what you can and run, because that will mean the walls are breached. Understood? Sir, came the shout. If you need to check the status of the battle, the flags on the tower behind you will duplicate what is going on around us. Just remember, if the castle launches any flares, it means business. Almost on cue, a whining sound came from the main tower of the castle. The noise became louder as a siren started. It was one of the World War II-style air raid devices that was powered by hand. Nick looked up to the tower and then back to the group. This is it. Make sure your vehicles are ready and your guns are loaded. You're the best we have. Don't do anything stupid and we'll make it through this. Wait for the signals. And good luck. The 2 groups of fighters moved off to their quads and bikes and readied them for the coming battle. Nick headed inside the entrance of the castle and towards the lower tower, the largest tower in the castle. He ran up the spiral staircase with Artur and Carter close behind him. It took almost a minute to reach the top, but the view was excellent and allowed him to view the entire town. Both bridges were visible, as was most of the town wall. Each of the key parts of the town had a flag flying, an idea suggested by Zach and his video gaming friends to indicate the status of the areas without expending resources. All the flags were green, indicating their zones were clear. "Nick!" shouted Artur. He turned to spot the flag at the main bridge had shifted to a red one. That meant the enemy had been spotted. Nick pulled out his binoculars and trained them along the bridge to the end. On the barricades he could see a number of people standing along the top with a variety of close-quarter and ranged weapons. Each of the groups was mainly armed with hook guns and a number of muskets. The shotguns and rifles were almost all being held by the reserve. Nick scanned up and to the left, where the road disappeared onto the ridge, and then he spotted the first creature. It staggered slowly towards the bridge, along with 3 others. A flash lit up the front creature, and a second later, the report from a musket echoed down the valley. Nick scanned back to the barricade and spotted a plume of white smoke drifting away. Another fired, and he looked back to see one of the creatures on the ground. "Good shooting! Makes a change for the muskets." He scanned the horizons. So far there were no other signs of zombies. Off to the left, he noticed the lower bridge was defended by Davy's group. It wasn't ideal, but he'd been overruled, and at least it kept him out of his way. At least it did until he spotted a problem. "Carter, look at the bridge down there. What do you see?" Carter took the binoculars and looked down at the bridge.
"It looks like Davies is taking most of the guards from the bridge to the boats. Yeah, look! They're moving down to the water! Fuck! Look!" he shouted.
They both looked down at the bridge and over to the other side. From the woods, a large group of creatures emerged, making their way to the bridge. Back at the barricade, on the small bridge, the 3 remaining men opened fire, way too early, with their 2 muskets and a hook gun.
"Fucking idiots," swore Nick. "That hook gun can take a whole minute to reload, and in that time they'll be on the bridge."
Nick was about to start his descent down the tower when the crackle of musketry indicated the arrival of the horde at the main bridge on the right. He looked across, spotting the dark mass partially obscured by the thick white smoke of guns. The defenders on the bridge barricade were putting up continuous and reasonably accurate fire. From what Nick could tell, it was an admirable showing of about 2 musket shots a minute, and that didn't include the crossbows. The undead were halfway down the ridge, but already the shooters had eliminated 24 of them.
"Carter, you stay here and monitor the situation. Control the reserve. You know the plan. Artur and I will sort out Davies," he said as he made his way down the stairs. More gunfire echoed through the valley. The battle was now well and truly underway. As they left the staircase and made for the massive castle gates, Artur appeared, concerned. "No sign of any of them from the east yet? Do you think they will come?" "In my experience, they're highly adaptable and can solve plenty of problems given sufficient numbers. Our big problem, though, is always the same one," said Nick.
"Human error," answered Artur.
"Exactly," said Nick, as he left the castle and approached the waiting motorcycles. They were battered-looking motocross bikes and equipped with racks for weapons, as well as extra armor on the vulnerable sections. Nick climbed on. The bike started first time. It was obviously much better maintained than its exterior would suggest. The engine roared, and he was quickly joined by Artur's bike. With a blip of the throttle, Nick pulled away and headed down the hill towards the river. Artur followed him down the winding road that led to a wide open space directly in front of the smaller bridge. Ahead of them people ran, some carrying boxes, others weapons. Very few, though, appeared to be watching the bridge. Nick raced in, stopped near the start of the bridge, and dismounted. He grabbed the first person that moved past. "What the hell is going on here?" he shouted. Davy said you ordered the evacuation. We're getting everything to the boats," the man answered.
Nick held on to the man's coat firmly. "Where's Davies?" The man pointed off to the right, near to where the boats were being pushed into the water. Nick spotted the balding man and his lackeys talking in a group. Nick turned back to the man. "Forget what Davy says. If you don't defend the bridge, I'll take it out of your ass. Understood? Now get back on the barricade and tell everybody else the same," he barked, whilst the confused and frightened-looking man staggered over the bridge. Nick grabbed several more people and sent them in the direction of the barricade, bolstering the numbers to over a dozen before turning back to Davies.
As he moved along the edge of the river, he noticed the horde were just 20 feet from the bridge's barricaded end. A mighty blast from one of the hook guns knocked down 4 of the creatures, but more marched over the bodies. He was now approaching the boats, and it was already clear what was going on. Food and stores were being loaded from the town's main warehouse.
"What the hell is going on?" Nick shouted.
Davies and the rest of his group turned around to face him. Davies looked nonplussed.
"What does it look like?" "We're leaving," he answered, and then turned away. Nick moved forward, but one of Davies' men stepped in his way. Artur was already there and smashed his fist into the man's nose. He followed up with a knee into his groin that sent the man to the ground, squirming. Nick grabbed Davies' shoulder and spun him around. "I'm talking to you. You're taking all our supplies, you fucking coward. Get back on the barricade and fight," he shouted. "Why?" "We can't hold this place. Apparently, there may be people on Lundy Island. If not, we'll follow the coast. Come with us if you want," he said in a matter-of-fact tone. "You'd abandon all these people?" said Artur, already fuming. "It's every man for himself," he replied. Nick had had enough. The sound of the gunfire was increasing, and it was clear the undead were now pressing the bridges hard. He pulled out his pistol and pointed at Davies' head. "I'm placing you under arrest. You're a risk to this town." Artur reached out and grabbed him, looking around for somewhere to put him. Off to their right were several storerooms where the boats and some of the supplies used to be kept. Nick nodded. "Yeah, put him in there," he said. Artur happily dragged the man off into the dark building and disappeared inside. Nick, on the other hand, was already heading back to the barricade and shouting at the people still moving supplies. "All of the bridge group, get back now! If you don't hold, we all die. Don't you realize? Davies knows we don't have enough boats. He's trying to save his own worthless skin," Nick shouted. The horde was now at the wall and trying to claw their way inside. Nick had seen this many times before, and mostly the numbers of the dead proved enough to break the defenses. "Come on, push them back!" he cried as he ran to the barricades. The bridge was a small iron affair and wide enough for only one vehicle. The barricade was about 20 feet wide and about 5 feet high. The raised platform gave a good fighting position to strike down at the dead. Nick lifted himself up to see what he could do to help. There were 18 men on the platform, most firing antiquated weapons, whilst another reloaded them behind, and then passed the loaded weapons back up to the platform. A zombie reached out, trying to grab at Nick. Without thinking, Nick pulled out his basher and brought it down hard onto the zombie's head, forcing the creature to collapse to the ground. He looked up and into the distance. All he could see were zombies. There must have been 300 or 400 of them. He turned back to the loaders behind them and held out his arms. 2 of the women passed him a loaded hook gun. It was one of the early designs and was bigger and heavier than the more recent weapons. The gun was fitted with a burning piece of cord that was lowered by a metal section to the touch hole of the weapon. It was primitive, but simple to make and operate. Nick lowered the weapon onto the ledge and aimed it at the mass ahead. He pulled the rough metal lever and watched the burning match cord lower to the touch hole. The homemade gunpowder fizzled and flashed. There was a brief pause, then the gun slammed back hard, and a massive volume of smoke obliterated his view. The sound was deafening, and Nick had to hold on to the barricade to stop from falling. He turned and passed the weapon down to find it replaced with a loaded crossbow. Nick turned back, the sound of the gun still blasting away. A tap on his shoulder indicated the arrival of Artur. He was bloodied, presumably from fighting along the barricade, and carried his machete in one hand.
"He's locked up. Are we holding?"
shouted Artur. The smoke cleared enough for Nick to get a clean shot. He fired the weapon, sending a bolt into the head of an approaching zombie before handing the weapon back. The bodies were now starting to mass along the base of the barricade, essentially raising the following zombies by almost a foot. Artur drew his machete, and the two hacked down several more creatures before stepping down. Their places were immediately taken by fresh fighters. Nick looked around the side of the barricade, noting with satisfaction that the number of undead were easily half of what they had been.
"Yeah, we're holding for now. The question is, what about the rest of the town?"
he said, as he looked up to the castle. The two moved back to the motorcycles that were where they'd left them. As they reached the bikes, a bright flash lit up the sky from a green flare. The two men followed the trail down, noting it had come from the other end of the town.
"Shit. Is that the east side?"
asked Artur.
"Yeah," said Nick. "Come on. We need to get over there, and fast."
Chapter 5. Lundy Island, England. A week had passed, with the populace having a day off from their not particularly strenuous or stressful work. Later that day, the remaining islanders assembled at Milcom House, which Roger had taken as his home along with Dave and Steve, a native of the island. Many evenings the community met for dinner at the large manor house. After all the friends and family that everyone had lost, all welcomed the evening company.
"Looks like a storm is coming in,"
said Steve.
"Yes, it does look that way," said Roger. "Have we got much firewood?" asked Dave.
"Yeah, tons," said Steve.
Kelly placed 3 wine bottles down on the table near Roger for him to open, of which he began doing.
"I suspect we'll be running low on wine before long," said Roger. "Yeah. Well, it has been almost a year since our last trip to the mainland. I'll organize another for next week."
"Good chap. Where would we be without wine?" asked Roger.
"Rather more sober, I should think," shouted Dave.
"And why, by God, would we ever want to be that?"
Roger asked them.
The group chuckled as Travis and James began to bring food through. They took it in turns each week to prepare the meals. Life had become steady and consistent for all of them now, almost forgetting the luxuries they were used to in their previous lives, and the horrors of the recent years. No longer did they have guard duties, patrols, and soldiers, just a simple farming community. The weapons and armors they had used to reach or defend the island were now long packed away in their homes, but always ready for a rainy day. Later that night, the islanders got up to return to their homes, having already heard the wind beating on the walls of the house. Dave opened the front door to let their friends out, but was nearly thrown off his feet by the wind which threw the door inwards, crashing against the inner wall.
"Fuck me, that's a bit much," shouted Dave. "Yeah, and the rain hasn't come yet," James said.
"You best be off quickly," Roger said. The guests piled out of the big manor house into the howling wind. A few hours later, the storm really hit the island hard, and torrential rain and gales poured down. Slates were thrown off many of the roofs, and some windows broken by debris. It was the worst weather any of them had ever witnessed. The next morning, Roger and Dave stepped out of their home to survey the damage.
"That was a rough night."
"No shit, Roger. We'll have to take the day off for repairs," said Dave.
"Yes. Notify everyone, stay at home, and do the repairs necessary. If you need help, come here to find it. And if you have nothing to repair, help those around you."
"All right, I'll get on it," replied Dave.
An hour later, there was a ladder propped against Milcom House, and Dave was on the roof with Tommy. Neither man had even been on a roof before, let alone any knowledge of fixing them. But needs must as the devil drives. In the disorganized day of repairs and work, everyone lost sight of the boys, Ryan and Dennis. The community let the boys play freely on the island, content in the safety their isolated community gave them. It was 2 hours before anyone noticed that the lads were missing. When Sandra got concerned and started asking questions, having assumed they were safely mingling with the islanders as they made the repairs. She ran up to Milcom House. The men could already see the worry in her face.
"What's happened?" asked Roger.
"The boys! I can't find them anywhere!"
she shouted. "You're sure they're not with any others doing the repairs?"
"Yes, I've checked with everyone."
"What are they thinking?" asked Dave.
"They're boys. They've probably just gone off on an adventure," said Roger.
"So, you're going to do nothing?"
asked Sandra. "No, of course not. Sandra, go inside and sit down. I'll make you some tea, but leave me a minute to discuss this with Dave before he goes to look for them."
Thank you so much."
She walked in through the front door, and Roger waited until she was well clear of them before turning to Dave. "What's up?" asked Dave.
"This is probably just kids having their fun, but this storm and them disappearing all at once makes me just a little suspicious. Or cautious, at least. I want you to grab 3 of the guys and head out to find them. Never be alone at any one time. And Dave, take the weapons," said Roger.
"You think we'll need them?"
"I don't believe so, and hope not. But you never know. These are uncertain times, and there's always some threat from the other survivors wanting to take what we have. People are far from civil in desperate times, as we know."
Dave walked into the big old house and went upstairs to where they kept their weapons. All of the islanders kept weapons in their homes in cases of emergency. Many were close-quarter weapons. He grabbed 2 double-barrel shotguns, 2 bows, 2 satchels of ammunition, and 2 quivers. He pulled on his leathers, a good solid lightweight protection, hoping he wouldn't need it. Dave was startled by the sound of someone entering the room. It was Steve.
"What's going on?"
"The boys are missing. It's likely to be nothing, but Roger wants me to proceed with caution. You coming?" asked Dave.
"Yeah, sure."
"All right. We don't want to cause any panic. Go grab Tommy and Jones, and meet me 100 yards behind the house."
20 minutes later, the 3 men met Dave, confused to see him sitting with weapons beside him.
"What are those for?"
"We're going looking for the boys who have gone missing. Tommy, we have no reason to believe there's any risk to us, but that is not a reason to be careless. They're probably just messing around and having fun, but I want us to stay safe and sensible," said Dave. "Where do you think they've gone?" asked Tommy. "I would say the Northwest Lighthouse is most likely. It's where I would go. The furthest point from home and a fun place to mess about," said Dave.
He passed them their weapons, the bows to Steve and Jones, the spare shotgun to Tommy. They set out following the easterly coastline, not wanting to cross paths with the other islanders and cause them any undue panic. All the islanders lived in the south of the island, among Milcom House, the church, and Morisco Tavern. The survivors used the fields in the south for farming, whilst the northern part of the island remained unused, apart from casual walks in their spare time. With their weapons and ammunition slung over their backs, the 4 men continued on across the island. It was a 45-minute walk to the lighthouse, though they were constantly on the lookout for the boys or evidence of them. It was a quiet walk, the light rain starting early on and then pouring constantly, along with a light breeze. The group reached the lighthouse with no sign of any life, though Dave noticed the back door to the lighthouse was open. He shouldered his shotgun and stepped carefully towards the opening, Tommy following suit. "You ready?" asked Dave.
"Yeah," said Tommy.
"Go!" Dave shouted. The two men stormed through the open door, raising their weapons as they got into the room. There was no movement at all, though Ryan's baseball cap was lying on a desk towards the front of the room.
"They must have been here recently, Dave," said Tommy.
"No shit." The two men lowered their weapons and strolled towards the front of the room where the large windows looked out to sea. Dave picked up the cap, thinking about where they would have gone next.
"Fuck! When did that appear?" asked Tommy.
"What?"
"Come and check it out."
Dave walked to the window where Tommy was still looking out. To Dave's surprise, the object he was talking about was a large fishing trawler beached on the rocks. The vessel was in rough shape, the hull smashed and breached in a few places, and it was lying almost on its side, completely stuck on dry land.
"Oh, shit. That's exactly where they will have gone," said Dave.
"Why?" "Wouldn't you have, when you were a boy?" said Dave.
"Fuck yeah," said Tommy.
"Exactly."
"What do you reckon's on board?" asked Tommy.
"Who knows? Could be empty. Bodies, maybe. Though I don't like the look of it already," said Dave. He threw down the boy's cap and walked out to the two men who stood outside.
"The lads were here, but now we have to trawl on the rocks below. It's likely they went, but let's take this easy. We have no idea what to expect. It could contain useful supplies. It could be dangerous. We just don't know," said Dave. "How long you reckon it's been there?" asked Jones. "I would say the storm last night chucked it ashore. Someone would have spotted it if it were much longer. Let's go on."
The men made their way slowly towards the stricken vessel. The dirty, smashed wreck was a depressing sight, made worse by the increasing rate of rain that was pouring down on them. Tommy took point across the pebbles and crossed to the huge hulk. He crept closer towards the wreck, clearly weary and a little frightened. It was an ominous-looking thing. He stopped and looked down.
Dave? What the fuck is that?"
Dave stepped forwards towards Tommy's position and looked down to see what looked like a fairly fresh pool of blood. The two looked at each other with fear, both praying that this was not the same hell they had experienced years before.
"Look, there are drops of it heading towards the ship. Let's check it out, and be ready for anything," said Dave.
They stepped quietly and carefully towards the rusty hulk, heading for the opposite side. There were a couple of large holes in the bulkhead, clearly breached by the vessel being lashed upon the rocks. As they took the bend around the large bow, Tommy could already see one of the boys stood 50 feet in front, beside of the hull.
"Dave! Dave!"
said Tommy. Dave came into view of the boy, not knowing whether to be relieved or concerned. It was Ryan, and his back was turned to the men, just stood looking out to sea. The men stepped warily closer towards the boy, praying that he was just in shock.
"Ryan? Hey, Ryan! It's Dave. Are you okay, son?"
There was no response. They continued to step closer, not letting their guard down, following the shape of the tall hulk.
"Ryan, talk to me,"
pleaded Tommy. Finally, the boy started to turn around, and Dave began to feel a sense of relief already, but his hopes were dashed within seconds. As the boy turned to look at the men, the crazy eyes of the zombie horde was quickly apparent, blood staining much of his clothing.
"Fuck me sideways,"
said Dave.
Jesus Christ, not again! Not my Ryan!
sobbed Tommy. All of the men raised their weapons, but as Jones strung an arrow onto his bow, he was struck from the side. A zombie had burst out from a gaping wound in the ship's hull and knocked him to the floor with its body weight. The other 3 men turned to react, but the creature had already taken hold and driven its teeth into Jones' throat. The man screamed out in agony. Dave shouldered his shotgun to fire, but Steve had noticed Ryan was almost onto them already. He swung the stock out and clubbed the boy in the face, smashed his nose, and knocking him backwards. Dave pulled the first trigger on his shotgun. The creature's head above Jones exploded, sending blood all over the wounded man. Dave immediately turned and lined the shotgun up to Ryan's head, not hesitating to fire. The skull exploded as the ball bearings tore through the boy's small skull, his body toppling lifelessly to the stones. "Jones?" asked Dave. The man could not respond. He was gurgling his own blood, his windpipe torn apart. His blood mixed with the body of the zombie in a horrible mess. He had only moments to live. "I'm sorry, Jones, but take relief in the fact that we will not let you become one of these things," said Dave. Steve stepped forward. He aimed his shotgun carefully and squeezed the trigger. Jones's body went immediately lifeless as the area was coated in yet more blood.
"What the fuck is going on here?"
cried Tommy.
"I would say that it's quite clear. This boat contains zombies, or people that became infected somehow. The real question is, how many of them are there?" asked Dave.
"How many would you think?"
asked Steve. "Honestly, I have no idea. A trawler like that would have a crew of 2 dozen, maybe. I'm guessing. Maybe more. But in these times, they could have had any number of poor bastards on board," said Dave.
"What do we do now, Dave? What can I tell his mother?"
Tommy cried, with tears streaming down his face. "The only thing we can do is get back to town, and hope we get there first." He broke open the barrel of his side-by-side shotgun and pulled the smoking, empty cartridges from it, throwing them to the ground. As he loaded 2 new shells in, he heard the resounding clang of the church bells at the opposite end of the island.
"Fuck!"
shouted Dave. "Now we are truly fucked.
They must be there already,"
said Steve. The town was quiet, tired from the repair work they had undertaken, with concern setting in deeply for their missing boys. No one feared the threat of zombies anymore. They were almost a forgotten enemy. But they did fear the misadventure that boys could find with a strong sea around their island. Travis and Kelly were sitting on the stone wall which surrounded the church, looking out to sea. Many of the other islanders were in their homes, getting cleaned up following the work. It was already getting dark, and the heavy cloud cover and rain was darkening it further. But Travis and Kelly could not think of anything else but their boy. Roger walked past the couple as he was heading towards the church.
"Hey, Roger, any news?"
asked Travis.
"No, nothing yet." "Why don't we get more people out there looking for the boys?" shouted Sandra as she walked by. "You know, that's just unwise and downright dangerous. We have no idea why they are missing. It's probably nothing. But we cannot afford to take such large risks. The 4 men I've sent are capable and will find them," said Roger. "Where are you heading?" asked Travis. "Up to church. I've a few supplies to drop there." It was indeed true that Roger was carrying supplies to the church, but not the everyday supplies that the couple were thinking, but weapons and ammunition.
The large bergen on Roger's back contained several handguns and small shotguns from the raiders the week before. He was hoping that Dave would return with the boys, but also already concerned that they had not. The church was a strong, defendable position, with good, clear visibility all around the tall walls. "Stop worrying. I'm sure they'll be back in no time. Now, why don't you go out in this awful weather, go home, get changed. I'll see you at my house later," said Roger. The couple nodded in agreement and got up to head to their home. A few minutes later, they were at the front door. The couple were pale and distraught from thinking about their son. When Kelly shot a glimpse down their garden to see the outline of their son, Dennis. "Dennis? Dennis!" shouted Kelly. The couple ran towards the boy who was stumbling towards the house. In her desperate need to hug her son, she paid absolutely no attention to his condition, pale and soulless. The blood running down his body was not visible due to the wound being to the side and back of his neck. As Kelly held him tight, she felt his jaw delve into her throat. She screamed out in agony as the realization that this was no longer her son set in. "No!" shouted Travis. He tried to step backwards, but in the panic tripped and fell to the ground. He was in utter shock, having lost both his son and wife. He looked up at his wife, reeling in pain, soon to die, and his son, who was already bearing down on him. Travis could have got up and run, but had lost the will to live and move, and was still in too much of a state to think anything different. Dennis climbed onto his father and bit into his flesh, whilst the man still looked in desperation at his dying wife. From inside the thick stone walls of the church, Roger was completely oblivious to Kelly's screams. These shrieks of agony had, however, not gone unnoticed to some of the other islanders. Derek and Katie quickly grabbed an axe and club hammer from their kitchen and ran out to find the source of the problem. Reaching their neighbor's home, they could see the bodies of their friends on the ground, Dennis still biting into his father, who was now lifeless. Zombies began pouring towards them from behind the couple's house. "Jesus Christ! We're finished," cried Derek. "Let's go!" shouted Katie. "Where?" Before she could answer, further screams rang out from people who lived in the next house. "Do we help them?" asked Eric. "No. Either they can help themselves or they're goners. Let's get to the church!" shouted Katie. The couple had got up to a jogging speed, knowing they could outrun the creatures, at least in the short term. As they ran the short distance to the church, it was quite clear that they were overcome with zombies. They reached the building, but the heavy wooden door was locked. They beat heavily against it, praying somebody would live inside to open for them. Looking around, the horde was already closing in on them, with 30 creatures in sight already. "Fuck! What do we do?" asked Derek. The heavy bolt slid across the big door and heaved open by Roger. He looked first at the shocked look of his two friends, and then into the distance beyond them. His expression turned to dread. "Get inside! Now!" The couple ran in through the doorway, and Roger slammed the door shut, with the creature just 40 feet from their position. "What the hell happened?" asked Roger. "No idea. They came out of nowhere. Kelly, Travis, and Dennis were all gone, and we heard screams coming from the house next door to us." "Christ, we're overrun. I'll get on the bells," said Roger. He ran to the bell tower of the church and immediately began to yank the ropes of the church bells, the emergency signal that they could be heard across the whole island. He only hoped that there were other survivors left to hear them. He went back to Katie and Derek. "Are those the only weapons you have?" asked Roger.
Yes,
said Katy.
I've got some guns here, but not a huge amount of ammo. Let's break them out.
Emptying Roger's bag out onto the table, they began to take stock of what weapons they did have. 2 .357 revolvers, with 12 rounds only, a Glock with just 7 rounds left in the magazine, and a sawn-off shotgun with 5 rounds.
"This it?"
asked Derek.
"Yes. There are more supplies at our house, but that's no help to us now. I only bought these here as an emergency measure. None of us could have expected a full-scale attack."
"How did they even get here?" asked Derek.
"I have no idea. If Dave is still alive, he'll probably have more answers, but that's just no help to us now,"
said Roger.
"So what do we do?"
asked Katy.
"Any idea on the horde's numbers?"
asked Roger.
"We've seen about 50, but I can bet there are a lot more out there. Those were just the ones we could see,"
she answered.
"Shit. And we only have a few options,"
said Roger.
"Which are?"
asked Derek.
"Well, this place is solid. They can't get in. We can wait it out here, hoping Dave and his guys are alive and can help us out. We can try to fight them out ourselves, or we can make a break for the jetty and take a boat. But we have no idea if his help is coming. Not enough ammunition to fight, and nowhere to go if we get a boat," said Katy. "Hey, I didn't say they were ideal. I said they were our only options," shouted Roger. "Jesus Christ, we're fucked," Derek said. "Quite possibly, yes," said Roger. The couple went silent, thinking about the crappy options that lay before them. "I cannot believe that after 10 years of survival, that this is what has come to. What did we do wrong?" asked Katy. "I said we make a break for my house. At least we'll have the weapons we need to fight back," said Roger. "And if we don't make it?" said Derek. "Then we go down fighting. The longer we wait here, the larger horde we'll get, and the less chance we'll have of breaking out." "All right. At least that's the plan," said Katy. "Right. I'll take the shotgun and the Glock. You take the revolver each, and keep on to those tools you have. They'll probably be needed," said Roger. The 3 survivors picked up their weapons and got everything in order. "You ready?" said Roger. "Yeah," said Katy. "Remember now, no hesitation. When I open the door, we give 'em hell. And keep at it until we can get free." "Okay," said Derek. Roger stood in front of the big door with the shotgun by his side in his left hand, and the Glock aimed at the doorway. Katy was beside him. Derek slid the bolt across. The weight of the creatures flung it open. "Fire!" screamed Roger. Chapter 6. The March, United Kingdom. Nothing could have prepared Nick and Artur for the scene that awaited them along the eastern wall. This part of the town hadn't faced trouble in several years, and for some unknown reason, a large horde was already at the wall, battering at the stone walls and wooden gate. Gunfire rained down onto the attackers, but the weapons appeared to have little effect on such massive numbers. As Nick and Artur dismounted, the 10 men from the mobile reserve arrived. They'd obviously spotted the signal at the same time. The men stood for a moment, assessing the situation. Gary, the ex-policeman, saw the problem first. "There, part of the wall's collapsed,"
he shouted before running to the problem area. He was right. The tall medieval wall had a breach about 6 feet wide, and in the gap, a small number of militia were bravely trying to hold back the horde.
"Come on, get in there,"
shouted Nick, as they rushed to the spot. Several bodies were on the ground by the time they reached the breach. Gary was already in the breach, swinging his mace and protecting himself with his riot shield. Each swing brought another zombie down. 5 more of the reserves jumped in, hacking and slashing at the monsters that they were trying to get inside. Nick pulled back one of the original defenders. "Use the rubble from behind!" He pointed at the demolished houses and shops. "And get this hole filled in!" The man nodded and ran to enlist the aid of several more people to help move the rubble. Nick moved back to the breach and joined in, his tough metal blade proving the perfect weapon for such a fight. As he swung his blade, he called to Artur. "Get guns and walls to drive back the zombies. We need to give them time to repair the breach." He called, and Artur moved off to carry out the plan. 2 of the reserves appeared with a slightly burnt door and moved it into the breach, pushing back the zombies. "Forward!" shouted Nick, as the small group pushed, forcing the zombies back and outside the wall. Gunfire from the wall rained down, slightly reducing the numbers moving to the gap. A massive blast from one of the hook guns created a large dent in the bodies. Dropping the door down in front of them, the men crowded around the improvised wall. The battle raged on as more and more pieces of wood, stone, and debris were brought forwards to the repair hole. 2 more blasts from the hook guns cleared the space in front, finally giving the men the time they needed to erect something more substantial. Nick hacked down another creature before the numbers thinned enough for him to take a deep breath. He looked around, noting the greatly reduced numbers of the undead. The breach was filling in nicely, and the militia were now able to hold their own and continue repairing the damage. "Good work, people! We need to get back the vehicles! Let's go!" he cried. The group moved back, their places now taken by the defenders of the sector. One of the men moved up. It was Zach, the gamer they met years ago. "Thanks, man. That was looking pretty rough. We can hold it from here. There was a weakness in the wall. Anything you need?" Nick tapped him on the shoulder. "We're good. You just watch the wall." Zach nodded and turned back, helping the rest with the repairs. Nick and Artur faced the bloodied but uninjured reserves. They looked an absolute mess, but they had certainly done an incredible job. Another flare arced across the sky, this time from the western sector, presumably one of the bridges. Before they could move, it was joined by another from the southern wall. "Come on, guys. We'll take the south. The bridge is closest to the castle. They can deal with that one," shouted Nick as he lifted his motorcycle from the ground. The rest of the group did the same as they headed off to fix yet another potential crisis. The battle for the southern wall was less desperate than the previous fight. There was no breach, but the real problem came from the storm. It started just as the reserve reached the wall, but by the time they were able to reach the battlements and help drive off the attacks, the rain and wind had lashed the defenses, making it hard to see, let alone fight. As well as this, the rain made the muskets and hook guns far less reliable. Nick had the rest sallied out and cut down the creatures near the wall, keeping them clear of the walls and the town. That wasn't the worst problem, though. It was the fire that had been the reason for the flare, and for the unfolding disaster in the area. That was 6 hours ago. Artur and the rest of the group were still trying to control the blaze. What had started as a misfiring hook had ended in a firing on damaged towers. Burning powder had blown in the wind and caught more of the stores and stacks of debris behind the hastily repaired fortifications. Now the fires had spread through more than 10 houses. Nick stood a short distance from the blaze, coordinating the effort. Carter arrived on his motorcycle looking flustered. His face was cut and bleeding quite badly. "What's going on? We can see the fire from the castle," We're holding. It looks worse than you might think, said Nick, though he didn't sound very convincing. Okay, well, we've got bigger problems. The bridges? Asked Nick. No, they're holding. The problem is Davies. He's managed to get out and inside the castle. I tried to stop him and ended up getting this in the face, he said as he pointed to his cuts. He stripped out his reserves and taken them somewhere, probably trying to save his skin like he usually does. Fuck, swore Nick as he paced around. What is he doing? He can only leave by road or boat. I doubt it will be by road. The vehicles are still in the compound and guarded near the Schelt Bridge. I bet the boat's where he's headed. A series of bright flashes came from the direction of the castle, indicating a major trouble and to retreat to the castle. What the hell? Shouted Carter. It was okay when I left. Come on, people, fall back, shouted Nick as he leapt onto his motorcycle. Those on foot jumped down from the wall and started running off to the castle, whilst the ones on bikes picked up as many as they could to carry back with them. The collapses of the defense came quickly as the fighters left their positions to retreat to the safety of the ancient fortress. Without firearms to cover the gates and doors, some zombies were already tearing their way inside. Nick and the rest of his mounted group made their way slowly through the retreating fighters, all converging on the one place. The rain was now coming down even harder, and to make matters worse, the sun was going down, reducing the light and visibility even more. As the columns rounded the last bend, they spotted the castle, flares still launching off into the sky. Defenders trickled in from the bridges, heading through the great gate where the mobile reserve had gathered just hours before. The mobile column rode up the main path and inside the castle courtyard to find about 15 ragged defenders waiting for them. Nick jumped off, looking up at the great tower, noting the flares still launching, but no people appeared to be visible. He turned to Artur, who was getting close behind him. Help get everybody inside. We need this place secured in the next 10 minutes. Get guns on the walls and make sure the rear gate and the sally ports are secured, he ordered. Artur nodded and ran off, taking 2 of the reserve fighters with him. Nick headed for the spiral staircase at the great tower, whilst more fighters returned to the castle. He ran as fast as he could, determined to get to the top, to see for himself what was happening. As he reached the top level, he found nobody. Just several crates with burning match cords and another dozen rocket flares. Another whooshed off before he could pull out the burning cord. As he stood at the top, he looked across the horizon, noticing the last of the defenders making their way inside the castle. What worried him the most was that there didn't appear to be any people at the bridges, and the zombies were making their way across and towards the castle. Movement near the water caught his eye. The bastard! He swore as he spotted Davies pushing out a boat, along with half a dozen of his comrades. Artur appeared next to Nick. Nobody knows what has happened. They assumed it was you sending the signal. It was me. It's that asshole Davies. And look, he's leaving by boat. He must have triggered him to get people away from the rivers and the boats. Artur looked over the ledge, spotting the men making their way to the water. He pointed out near to them. Look, the dead are already there. They must have broken through at the small bridge. The barricade was partially knocked down, and a group of at least 100 zombies advanced past the bridge and towards the boats. Davies and his people had almost got to the boat into the water when the zombies cut them off. A desperate battle started, but Nick turned back to Artur. Serves the bastard right. We have our own problems. The two looked down to the perimeter of the castle, Hundreds more zombies swarmed around the entrance, and it looked like they were circling. In just a few more minutes, the castle would be completely surrounded. Gunfire erupted along the walls and from the towers as the survivors did their best to force the zombies back. "Come on, back to the courtyard. We need a new plan," said Nick as he headed down the staircase. The battle continued around them, and by the time they reached the courtyard, the entire outer wall was covered in white smoke from the battle. They met in the middle, where they were joined by Zack and Gary, who were both covered in gore from close-quarter combat.
"The drainage tunnel and the sally ports are not going to last long. The numbers are too great. Also, there are two groups at the main doors. I don't know how long the doors will last before they can get in," said Gary.
The sound of the creatures smashing their bodies against the ancient wood was terrifying to less than 60 people still left from the start of the battle.
"Jesus, we're missing so many people. That arsehole Davies really screwed us over. There's no way we could hold them from in here," said Nick.
A group of people came rushing in from the back section of the castle. They pulled the inner door shut behind them, whilst more of them fired weapons at whatever was inside that part of the castle.
"What about the convoy? We could use him to break out," asked Gary.
Zack pushed forward.
"Yeah, I think about 7 cars and trucks are still running. We can get checking him early in case we need to move people around the town. Trouble is, they're outside." "How can we get to them?" asked Carter.
"There's only one way. We need a diversion to get enough of us time to get the civilians out," replied Zack.
"I have an idea," said Artur. "If I take a team of 6, we can go down to the wall and draw them from the main doors. That will give time to assemble the convoy. Just don't go without us."
"I don't like it," said Nick. Screams came from the weakened wall in the main courtyard. It was part of the wall that had been blown apart by cannon in the 1600s, but had since been repaired. The zombies, with their weight of numbers, seemed to have forced a small hole in it, and several arms were pushing inside.
"Gary, plug the breach!"
shouted Nick before turning back to Artur. Gary and Zack ran to the breach, quickly followed by one of the Johnson brothers and Jake, still wearing his medieval armor.
"Do it. Fire a flare when you've drawn them away, and then we'll get everybody down to the side of the castle to the carpool," said Nick.
Gary shook Artur's hand.
"Good luck, you crazy bastard."
The man turned around and ran inside to the rest of the defenders in the courtyard to assemble his people for the diversionary attack. At the breach, the wall had crumbled enough that 2 zombies at a time could climb through. Gary and Zack forced the horde back with their shields, whilst the defenders on the walls dropped rocks and fired hook guns at those pushing behind them. The rain continued, and it did nothing to help the defense of the castle, other than reduce the chances of fire spreading. Nick ran to the breach, picking up one of the dropped riot shields, and slammed it against another 2 to create a strong wall. There was a cry as Jake fell, his legs pulled from beneath. Zack tried to help him back, but at least a dozen arms pulled him back through the breach and out to the horde on the other side.
"Come on, Artur! Pull them away!"
he muttered, while striking another creature with his blade.
"We can't hold for long."
It had been nearly half an hour since Artur and his party had climbed down the outer wall and attacked the horde. Incredibly, they had pushed over 100 yards away and had occupied the old tourist information center. The cracks and bangs from their firearms indicated they were alive and fighting hard. Nick and his group waited next to the castle gate, whilst Carter watched from the walls immediately above them. He shouted down,
"There are only a couple of them left.
he cried. Nick turned around. The rest of the defenders, now only just over 40, were waiting with them with few weapons and supplies they could find. Zack and Gary waited at the front, along with what was left of the mobile reserve. The inner doorway was still shaking from the horde trying to break inside. "Ready?" shouted Nick as he turned. A shout came back that was immediately followed by bars being removed from the castle. As they swung open, they revealed a mass of bodies, the consequence of the recent battle. A small number of zombies gathered around, but it was nothing like their previous numbers. "Now!" shouted Nick as he rushed through the doors with his blade drawn. The rest rushed after him, people with supplies in the middle and the armed combatants on the outside to fight off any attackers. They ran down the main path and around the castle to the motor pool. Already the number of zombies was increasing at the arrival of this many living, and was certainly drawing attention. The motor pool contained a dozen vehicles that were always kept in a state of readiness. It was covered on 3 sides by a low wall, though in recent years gaps had appeared, and some of these were already sheltering a number of the undead. Nick, Carter, and another 7 fighters rushed forwards and hacked their way through the zombies at the front of the area, and in seconds reached the first vehicle, a heavily armored bus. Carter tore open the door and signaled for people to get in. They then moved on to the next vehicles, hacking and slashing as they went. As Carter reached an old 1970s Land Rover, 2 zombies lurched out of the rubble and knocked him hard against the thick-skinned aluminum body. Nick jumped in, striking the first zombie with his armored glove. More of the fighters arrived and dragged the other zombies, stabbing and hacking the creatures. Some of the survivors climbed aboard the Land Rover, leaving the fighters to move on further. One jumped in the back, and Zack quickly followed. "They're coming!" shouted one of Johnson brothers, as he waved out to the river and small bridge. A large number of the undead were moving out of the cover of the housing along the water's edge, probably drawn by the sound of the battle. The survivors were now at the motor pool, and most had climbed inside the nearest vehicle. Nick hung onto the side of the Land Rover and banged on the door, indicating it was time to leave. The vehicles pulled out slowly with the Land Rover at the front and closely followed by 5 other vehicles, including the armored bus. The Land Rover was equipped with an armored plow fitted to the front, as well as more armor plating and a weapon mount on top. The other vehicles were all modified in a similar fashion. As the vehicles rounded the corner, they were stopped by the horde. Their numbers were immense, and blocked the entire road leading through the town. "Fuck!" shouted Carter, as he looked out of the driver's seat in the Land Rover. Nick climbed inside, turning to him. "We have to get through. Can you force through?" "No way! Not this many! We need to thin the horde and fast," he said, sounding a little excited. Several plumes of white smoke blasted across the street, and holes appeared in the horde. Behind the smoke, a number of shadows could be seen, along with the movement of weapons. "Look!" shouted Carter. "Looks like Artur and his team!" "Step on it! We need to help him," said Nick. Carter pushed the pedal down hard, and the V8 engine revved angrily. With a lurch, he dropped the clutch and the truck pushed ahead and towards the battle. Zack climbed up through the hatch in the roof and to the mounted weapon. A World War II vintage Bren light machine gun. He pulled back the bolt and opened fire. Each heavy bullet easily tore through the soft flesh of the zombies and helped clear the path. Artur and his small group were now only 50 feet away and were fighting in the middle of the road. Every few seconds, the blast from a hook gun or shotgun exploded in the street and sent blood and gore against the walls of the abandoned homes. Some of the zombies broke away and staggered toward the convoy. Several more bursts from the Bren gun tore through them. As the Land Rover arrived, it slammed into few surviving zombies, their soft bodies smashing onto the heavy plow. The arrival of the vehicles wasn't soon enough, though, and at least 50 more zombies stood between the Land Rover and Artur and his fighters. Nick opened the door and made to jump out when more of the horde pushed through from the side streets. He slammed the door shut as one of the creatures pulled at the handle. Grabbing a sawed-off shotgun from the mount on the dashboard, he pulled it out through one of the slits in the door and fired a blast that sent the first 3 zombies backwards in a spray of blood.
Fuck! We can't get to them, and they can't go forward either. There are too many of them,
shouted Nick. The vehicle started to rock as more zombies pushed and pulled the vehicle. Nick looked behind, noting the rest of the convoy was close behind him and in the same position. Blasts of smoke came from all sides of the bogged-down convoy, turned into a long metal fort. Out in front, Artur and his group were retreating up the hill and towards an abandoned hotel. As they fell back, the zombies pushed after them, eager to reach the fresh blood of his team. One of the men, possibly one of the Johnson brothers, was dragged down. Yet he continued to hack away with his blade until he disappeared under a mass of zombies. The rest of them were desperately moving slowly backwards, now just 20 feet from the entrance.
"Floor it! We need to help 'em,"
ordered Nick as he reloaded his shotgun. Carter revved the engine as hard as he dared and pushed forward. The plow forced many out of the way, yet the mass of bodies choked the convoy and reduced their speed to just a walking pace. Nick fired more shots, trying to clear those in front so they could build up some momentum. The road came to a wider section suitable for large vehicles, and the armored bus pushed up alongside the Land Rover and added its own mass and firepower to the battle. Several of the passengers had climbed onto the roof and were hurling rocks and firing crossbows at the undead. The rest of the vehicles moved up slowly behind these two.
"Where are they?"
asked Carter.
"Look!"
shouted Nick as he pointed to the hotel. Carter lifted himself, looking through the gaps in the armored slats running down the windscreen. He could just make out the small group of fighters working their way inside the hotel, followed by a stream of the undead. He turned back, seeing the reduced number of zombies on the road.
"They've done the job, though. I think we can get through."
"What about them, though? We cannot abandon them," said Nick.
"Maybe, but there are more coming. If we don't go now, we'll never get out," he said.
Gunfire continued from the rooftops of the vehicles as they kept up the slow pace. The door on the driver's side tore open to reveal another 4 zombies that quickly grabbed Carter. Nick leaned over, but it was too late. One of them had already bitten down hard onto his leg, and another had half dragged him out. Nick jumped over, striking the closest with the butt of his shotgun. Carter was now out of the Land Rover, and on the ground with 3 zombies on top of him. Nick made to jump out, but with nobody controlling the Land Rover, it stalled and stopped in the road.
"Fuck!"
shouted Nick as he jumped into the seat and restarted the engine. He reached out to the door to see Carter trying to stand up, only to be cut down from a shotgun blast. Either he'd been mistaken for a zombie, or one of the shooters behind had put him out of his misery. Pulling the door shut, he gunned the engine and pushed forward and up the road, the hotel now just off to his right. More zombies were staggering inside, and flashes could be seen from the broken hotel windows. Before Nick was able to decide what to do, a massive blast tore the building apart. Half of the ground floor collapsed, and the rest of the building caved in on top. The explosion filled the road with dust, smoke, and debris. "That's it. Time to leave," swore Nick to himself. With a final push of the accelerator, he moved off down the road, leaving the hotel, river, and the castle behind him. He checked his mirror to see the bus and the rest of the vehicles following. Zombies were still trying to get in their way, but as they built up speed, they were more easily able to brush the zombies aside. As they moved past a burning supermarket, Nick spotted the old town walls and the gate leading out to the west. A group of about 30 zombies were staggering around near the wall. They must have heard the convoy as they started moving along the road. A burst of fire from the roof-mounted Bren knocked a couple to the ground, but not enough to make a difference. "Hold on!" shouted Nick as the zombies and the gate loomed ever closer. The impact of the zombies was less than expected, but as they plowed through them, they came up against the gate. With a sickening smash, the Land Rover battered through the ancient wood and forced its way out onto the open road. The route ahead was littered with abandoned cars and small groups of zombies wandering around like drunks in the early hours of the morning. Nick had to turn the wheel hard to avoid a truck before recovering and continuing ahead. "Everybody okay?" he asked. Zach popped his head inside from the top hatch. "Yeah, okay here." "Yeah, great," said Johnson as he sat in the back cradling a crossbow. A loud crashing sound came from behind, and from his mirror, Nick spotted a Land Rover behind them, swerving off the road, and rolled over. "Shit, did you see that?" said Nick as he tried to see what was going on. Zach lifted himself back up, watching behind before shouting down. "Yeah, they hit the truck. The rest made it through, though. Just," he said. "Are we going back?" asked Johnson. The Land Rover shuddered as they smashed through another group of the horde. Nick looked briefly at him, then carried on driving. The vehicle shook several more times before Nick looked back at him. "No chance. We don't stop till we see the open road," said Nick. Johnson turned around and watched the burning town falling away behind them before he pulled himself forward to Nick. "What do we do now?" he asked. Zach appeared at the hatch, looking down at Nick. There was a silence for a moment while Nick considered their situation. Blasts from the firearms continued behind them as the rest of the convoy kept up their fire. "West. We just keep going west, and maybe we'll find something better," answered Nick. "You think so?" asked Zach. "No. Not really," Nick sighed. "We don't have any choice now." The Land Rover reached the top of the hill and joined the old highway heading west into the abandoned countryside of Wales, followed by the blood-spattered remains of the convoy. As the last vehicle passed the hill, a series of explosions could just be heard from the burning town as the last of the gunpowder caught fire. Chapter 7. Mexico. Madison awoke from the heat and light glaring in her face. At least it was the natural way to wake up, even if it meant far fewer hours' sleep than she would have liked. They hadn't bothered with the tents, the night having been warm, and they were all more concerned with more enjoying themselves than setting anything up at all. Jack strolled up to her as she still lay half inside her sleeping bag. "Morning."
"Hey, Jack. So what's the plan?"
"Your father says there's a good well in a village not too far from here. Or at least there was a long time ago, when he was there last. It's worth a shot," he said.
"Really? That much water would be a godsend."
"Yeah. Our stocks are looking a little low.
And having enough water so we could all have a good wash would be great for morale," said Jack. "Always the tactician, Jack?" asked Madison. "Of course. Someone has to keep us alive." He offered his hand out to help her up, which she gladly accepted. "We're heading out in 10, said Jack. "Have we any idea on the size of this village and the number of potential zombies?" "Honestly, no. Your father hasn't been there in over 20 years, but I'm guessing a few thousand population before Z-Day, so we might have a bit of a fight on our hands." "That's a wise move?" asked Madison. "Should be fine. Just keep your eyes open and head in the game," said Jack. "That's really helpful." "Yep, that's what I'm here for." It took 5 hours of riding until the village was in sight. Madison rode to the front of the stopped column, to where Wells and Jack were surveying the area. "How's it look?" she asked them. "Not great, but it could be worse," said Jack. "What are we talking about?" asked Madison. "Well, it's a clothes-covered well. Should be clean, and about a couple dozen zombies in sight. Will likely be at least a few more, of course." "What do you think, Jack?" asked Wells. "Well, we need the water, and those odds aren't terrible." "All right, let's do this, while we still have plenty of days left," said Wells. Jack turned back towards the column. "Listen up, everyone. Down there's all the water we could want, and it shouldn't be too much of a fight to get it. So armor up. No subtlety here. We head down the hill and smash anything in our way. However, we can't see everything. If for any reason the numbers are more than we expect, be ready to bolt. Listen for my whistle. Dale, Greg, you stay here with the wagon. Everyone okay?" They nodded and groaned in acknowledgement as they prepared for combat, just as they had done countless times before, not a single novice fighter among them. Jack turned his horse around and pulled his hatchet from his saddle, kicking his heels in. The group trotted towards the village at a relaxed speed, knowing they didn't want to rush into anything. As Jack reached the first creature, his companions behind, he swung the weapon down onto the creature's skull. He kept at the slow pace so he had time to pry the blade from the zombie's fractured head as he rode past. Madison quickly joined in with the violence, and moments later they'd reached the well, leaving 6 bodies in their wake. "Riley, Joey, check the well out. Everyone else, get this place cleared up," shouted Jack. The horsemen trotted between the lane created by the small houses of the village, until they reached a fork where 2 creatures staggered towards them. Madison went faster, and without stopping swung her hammer ruthlessly into the face of the first, with a heavy horizontal swing, before quickly recovering and striking to the other side as she rode past her 2 victims. "All right, doesn't look too bad from here. Get to the well. Set up a perimeter. Take Billy and Lucy with you," said Wells. Madison nodded in agreement, her 2 assistants turning to follow her. She reached the well. Riley was fiddling with some sort of mechanism. "You 2, you're on guard duty. Watch our backs," she ordered. She leapt from her horse and tied the reins to a pole on the well's exterior. It was a tall structure protruding from the ground, and a full cover on the top. It was made of modern materials, and clearly only a couple of decades old. "Any luck?" asked Madison. "Yeah, looks good so far," said Riley. Before she could continue, she heard the joyous sounds of water squirting from a tap, and water suddenly flowing out across the dry ground. "Fuck yeah!" shouted Joey. "That's a hell of a sight," said Madison. Jack rode back to the well with Wells at his side. They stopped abruptly. "It's working?" shouted Jack.
"Bet your ass!"
she shouted back. She pulled a small canteen from her backpack and filled it to the brim, as the rest watched in awe and anticipation. "All right, we're still sweeping the area, but it seems fairly safe so far. Get the wagon down here. We're setting up camp. There's no reason we can't spend at least a day or two here before moving out," said Jack. The survivors had spent a relaxing day with all the water they could ever have dreamed of. The last of the natural light faded away, and the guards were on duty, whilst the rest talked until they slept. At 3 a.m., Joey, finishing his guard duty, strolled over to the camp and kicked Dale lightly in the side. "Come on, you lazy bastard. Time to go to work," he said. Dale groaned, sweat running down his face. It had clearly been an uneasy sleep, something that was far from uncommon in the fatigued group of survivors. He turned over, rubbed his face and eyes, trying desperately to compose himself. "Come on, mate. Get your act together," said Joey. All right, I'm fine. Piss off," said Dale. He fumbled to pick up his machete belt and finally began to wrap it around his waist and stand up. The extreme tiredness and heavy redness in his eyes should have been a telltale sign to Joey. But it was dark. Dale kept his head down, and Joey was more concerned with getting some rest. Joey handed his lantern over to Dale, who stumbled off toward the edge of camp. Joey watched him go, shaking his head. What a lazy bastard. Without any further thoughts, he lay down and got comfortable. Thoroughly exhausted from his shift, and with not a care left in the world, he quickly fell asleep. The other two survivors on duty were Jade and Greg, Dale's brother. As Dale stumbled out to the edge of the camp, he saw the folding chair that Joey had left from his shift. Glad to find a new place to rest, he slumped into the chair, instantly feeling relieved. 20 minutes later, Dale woke up abruptly, being shaken on his shoulder. He sprang from his chair and quickly pulled his machete from his belt, the adrenaline creating a short injection of energy to his fatigued body. "What the fuck?" he shouted. Greg stood before him. "You were asleep, asshole. You know how serious that is. Do you want to kill us all?" asked Greg. "Fuck you. I'm exhausted, and it's all clear anyway," said Dale. "Yeah, all clear by luck, you fucking idiot." "What do you want?" asked Dale. "Nothing, except to know I can rely on you to do your job." "All right, I'm awake." "Really? You feeling okay?" asked Greg. "Exhausted, but what's new?" "All right, stick with it. Stay sharp. You'll have your turn to rest before long." Greg wandered back to the other side of camp, hoping his shock treatment would keep his brother awake. The adrenaline would certainly help. Dale stayed wide awake and alert for 20 minutes before his fatigue finally again overtook him. He relaxed further into the chair. His breathing slowed further until it became a gasp. Dale felt his body slow down, more than just to sleep. He thought this must be the end. Hardly a bad thing. The man took his last breath and then went limp in the chair. "Hey, asshole," said Greg. Dale's brother approached from behind the chair where he was sitting. His head was tilting over, asleep again. Greg was tolerant towards his brother, but only up to a point. He'd seen the results of negligence and laziness before, death and destruction. He quickened his pace and walked around in front of the chair. Looking down at Dale, his brother was completely out for the count. "Wake the fuck up," said Greg. When he got no answer, he grappled him by the collar and shook him. Dale's eyes shot open, but before Greg realized what had happened to his brother, Dale seized his clothing and pulled him closer, biting into his windpipe and ripping flesh from his neck. Greg dropped to the ground, trying to shout out a warning to his fellow survivors, but unable to release a sound, the blood choking him. 5 minutes later, Madison sprung from a deep sleep, alerted by a scream of pain and fear. Jack woke at the same time to an abysmal sight, one that they had all feared for years. 3 of their friends were screaming in either pain or shock. Blood was scattered about, some in the mouths of the standing, some on the clothes and flesh of others that were either lifeless or writhing in agony on the ground. "Jesus Christ!" shouted Jack. Jack grabbed for his whistle hanging on a ribbon around his neck and blew the high-pitched device, hoping to salvage at least some support and survivors. He leapt to his feet and grabbed his hatchet from beside his bed. He ran at the man he used to know as Greg, who had blood covering his shirt, a mix of his own and others. He spun the tool around and smashed Greg in the head with the blunt back edge, knowing he could not risk getting the weapon stuck. Greg dropped to the floor with the impact, the skull slightly splitting and leaking blood from beneath his chair. Jack hit again, and in the same fashion, to be sure, striking the brain ferociously. Turning around to survey the situation, Jack could see Madison hitting out at the outstretched arms of whatever used to be their friend Dale. The second strike of her hammer burst the creature's nose and forced it to stumble backwards. Before the beast could regain its footing, Madison leapt forward and dealt a deadly strike to the temple with a well-aimed swing, the creature falling to a lifeless mess. Madison and Jack looked around. A few other survivors had managed to get to their feet, but many were lifeless or bloody or wounded. "What do we do?" she asked. "We must purge all signs of the creatures," shouted Wells. "You mean kill what? Half our friends?" Jack sighed. He looked at his feet, not wanting to admit the situation to himself, let alone to Madison. "You know it has to be done. We'll all be dead within 48 hours, said Wells. "So what do we do? Kill at random?" asked Jack. "We need to divide the infected and the uninfected, immediately." "How?" asked Madison. "Everyone listen up. Those without injury, step to my right, into the open. Maddie and Wells will check over you," said Jack. Jade began to cry. She sat down, cradling her legs with her arms, knowing she was finished. Several of the wounded could do barely more than groan. Riley and Justin ambled over to where Jack had pointed, and Joey finally followed. "Maddie, Wells, check them thoroughly," Jack ordered. It was a horrific situation. Neither was comfortable with what had to be done. The father and daughter began checking their friends as if they were terrorists. "Listen up. You all knew this day was coming sooner or later. This world we now live in, it was insane to think we could survive, but we have this far. We've earned and fought for a longer life. No matter how much crap we've faced in these last 10 years, we have maintained a community. And we've had some good times. We've maintained our humanity. For many of us, that road has ended. Accept it. There's no shame in it," said Jack. Jade, still weeping, burst out with sadness. "So what? You're just gonna kill us?" "If you've been bitten, you have 2 choices.
Let us end your life before you become one of those fuckers, or you take a walk in the opposite direction right now, and don't stop until you can't walk any longer," Jack answered.
"That's it?"
shouted Katie. "What do you want me to say? You all know the reality of this. The longer you stay around, the more you risk our lives. We'll finish off those who cannot walk as peacefully and quickly as we can, and then we'll move off in a different direction."
"So this is it?"
cried Jade.
"I'm sorry to say, my dear,
"Yes," said Wells. "I'm sorry too, but we have no choice, and time's not on our side. First, we must finish off anybody who's at risk of turning in the next hour," Jack added.
How do we decide that?"
cried Madison. "If they're bitten and cannot stand, put 'em out of their misery. If they're bitten and can walk, either get 'em moving now or end it for 'em," said Jack. Madison looked at Jack with a look of terror in her eyes. She had faced all manner of evil and hardship in the last few years, but never had she had to kill her friends on such a huge scale. As far as she was concerned, they were the last 22 people in the world. To have to kill or let die over 3/4 of them seemed utterly dire and beyond belief.
"And then what? What are we going to do?"
she asked. "Load up, head out," said Jack.
"With so few of us left?"
"That's what we have. We can't change that," said Wells. "Come on. We have to get this done, or we'll all be finished," whispered Jack. "Madison, you check Riley, Justin, and Joey over. Wells, you're with me. Grab a weapon." Wells picked up a hammer that was lying on the ground. Jack took up his two-handed mace, a far better weapon when you had the space and time to maneuver it. Jack looked out across the bloody mess of the dead and wounded. None of those able to move had done so yet, not wanting to leave the community they'd lived and worked for. "Go on! Go!" shouted Jack. Those that could finally begin to stagger away from the camp, 8 in total, wandered into the wilderness, knowing full well that they had a matter of hours to live, or at least as human beings. Jack lifted his crude club and smashed it down onto the head of his first victim.
"Jack!"
shouted Madison. He spun around, on edge and alert. "What is it?"
"Get over here! Quick!"
He rushed over, not sure what to expect, but already concerned by her long face. He reached her position as she pointed to Joey's blood-stained jacket. She lifted the jacket up, revealing ripped flesh and blood beneath. Jack lowered his head in disappointment. Yet another friend who was finished.
"Hey, Joey, when'd you get bit?"
asked Jack. "What?"
"That bite on your side. That just happened?"
"What?
"I didn't get bit!"
shouted Joey. "That isn't a scratch, Joey," shouted Jack.
"But I didn't feel anything. I would have noticed."
"Maybe you were asleep. Maybe with the adrenaline and panic you didn't feel it. I don't know. But the only way you got that injury is from a bite. I'm sorry, but your time's over," said Jack quietly.
"What are you going to do?"
"I'm not going to do anything. You're going to take a walk and not come back."
"This is bullshit. Maddie, you don't believe that, do you?"
asked Joey.
"I'm sorry, but that's the truth. Nothing any of us can do about it," she answered him. This is fucking bullshit. So I'm supposed to go and die somewhere?
Afraid so. Or let us end it for you quickly, Jack said.
Well, fuck this and fuck you,
shouted Joey. He threw down the iron bar he was holding and stormed out of the camp, mortified by the situation and disgusted by his friend's response. That could have gone better, said Riley. Not really. How else can you tell a man he's going to die? Either alone and without a fuss, or risk the lives of everyone around him. He'll realize before the end that he made the right decision, said Wells. Not to be funny here, but now there are only 5 of us. How can we survive? Asked Justin.
We'll do our best. It's all anyone can do, and all that God can expect of us, said Wells.
That's done us a world of good so far. Madison was about to agree with Justin, but stopped as she noticed an increasingly loud banging noise.
What the hell is that? She asked.
What? Asked Jack.
Listen, that noise.
They all went silent, intently listening. The noise got louder and more frequent, a crashing noise, something that was truly worrying in a world with so few humans left. Jack grabbed his binoculars and walked 20 yards until he stood in what loosely resembled a street, staring down the line of dusty buildings. He raised his binoculars to his eyes and looked out for some sign of movement. At first he could see nothing, but then his attention was drawn to something that vibrated as he panned across the street. He focused on the front of the old church building. The doors shook, not through wind, but the force of creatures. He could see chains wrapped around the doors and secured with 2 padlocks. The doors thrashed against the chains, straining them. Jesus, fuck me, Christ. This is not our day. He ran back to the others, a look of dread on his face that the others had gotten used to understanding. They knew bad news would follow. That's the church. It's locked up and chained, but something's giving the door hell. I can only imagine it's most of the former population of this village.
What do we do?
Asked Madison desperately. We can't stay. We have no idea on their numbers, and we're now so few.
So, put your tail between your legs and run? Asked Justin.
That'd be about it, yeah, replied Jack.
Let's do this. I'm sick of the sight of this place, said Riley.
All agreed?
Not like we have a choice, added Wells.
All right, said Justin. Madison nodded in agreement. Okay, we've no idea how long those doors will hold for. Who knows? We must assume we're on borrowed time, Jack explained.
What can we do?
Asked Madison. We can take the wagon, grab your horses and a few spares, load up essential supplies only, make sure we have as much water as possible.
And be careful about what you take. There's a lot of blood around this camp. We cannot risk taking anything infectious, Wells added.
Moments later, the handful of survivors were busy salvaging everything they could. In just 5 minutes, they had loaded and prepared all that mattered in their world. Jack pulled himself wearily up onto his horse. Setting out every day was tedious and miserable, but doing it with less than a quarter of your friends surviving and too little sleep made it feel more hellish than ever. Jack wondered about Madison's desperate state the day before, wondering about their purpose in life. Maybe they didn't have one. Maybe life was over for them, and they were just prolonging the misery. He put the thoughts to the back of his mind, his responsibilities as the leader overtaking his personal misery. The others mounted their horses, and without a word from anyone, they began their march onwards, none of them knowing what to say. It was clear to all that the end of their lives was near. They only wondered when it would come. Chapter 8. English-Welsh Border, United Kingdom. The sun had now set, and they had been on the road for nearly 2 hours without a break, and it was starting to show. The dull yellow lights of the tired convoy made slow, wearied progress along the debris-strewn highway. The tiny group of battered, smoking vehicles were all that remained of the once strong compound known as the Green Zone, the last substantial refuge in the entire British Isles. After a long and bloody siege, only a dozen vehicles had been able to try and escape from the burning town, and of those only 6 had made it to the walled perimeter. In the ensuing violence, only 5 vehicles were able to fight their way to the safety of the road outside. It was a terrible event, that so few people escaped from the population of the 212 survivors of the zone. This was a tiny fraction of the brave souls who had stood against the horde for an entire decade, and the morale of those left was low. The road led away from the zone and deep into the heart of what was the lightly populated region of Wales. The roads were barely navigable, and the signs of life and civilization had long vanished in the battles, raids, and fires that had ravaged the region over months and months. They had limited supplies, weapons and ammunitions, but even worse, they didn't have a plan, or even a real objective to aim for. At the head of the column of vehicles was the battered and heavily scarred 70s Land Rover. It used to have a vivid beige paint scheme, but in the last years it had been repainted and modified to make it more useful for the survivors in the Zompok. The front of the vehicle was hidden by a massive iron plow that served both for protection of the vehicle and also to help clear dirt and debris. Unlike most Land Rovers, this one had been specifically chosen by Nick, the de facto leader of the group, due to the fact that it was fitted with a V8 engine. The extra torque and power was critical for moving heavy weights and pushing them out of dangerous situations. Up on top of the vehicle was a weapon mount upon which sat a 40s vintage Bren gun. The light machine gun had proven itself reliable and accurate on many occasions, not least during their violent escape from the town. Nick was sitting in front of the Land Rover, holding on to the buffeting steering wheel, as he maneuvered past yet another abandoned and damaged car. Inside the modified Land Rover were Zach and Max, both men of experience in the war against the dead, and both exhausted by their fighting just hours before. When they first met, they were hardly the best of friends, but in the course of this struggle, they had fought together in many encounters, and knew they could rely upon each other in combat. Nick looked into one remaining side mirror to check on the rest of the column. Immediately behind them was the armored bus that carried most of the civilians that had been evacuated. He couldn't quite make out the rest of the vehicles, though he could see the dust trail being kicked up by those behind the bus. So he pulled out the radio. "Hey everyone, give me an update. How y'all doing back there?" he asked. There was no response from the rest of the vehicles. Maybe their radio equipment wasn't working. Sat next to Nick was Zach, who was busy reading what was left of the old map of the area. He was trying to compare what the map showed to what actually existed in front of them. And in many places, it was as though he was looking at 2 totally different areas. "I don't like this. From what I can tell, it looks like the map shows the motorway is blocked from the damage last year. I don't think we're going to make it through. We're going to have to take either the city route or the southern valleys until we can rejoin the main road," said Zach. "Shit, that is a problem.
Do you remember the last time we went near the city? Said Nick.
Yeah, that didn't go so well, replied Zack.
The radio crackled into life.
No shit, muttered Nick under his breath.
A voice came from the radio as one of the vehicles responded to his initial message. We're okay, but the bus is running, but we've got red lights all over the dashboard. Looks like oil and fuel. I think we're leaking both. Either somebody didn't do their job before we left or took damage in the escape. Either way, I don't think we're going to be able to keep this pace for much longer.
Nick turned his head dismissively. That puts us in a real problem. A real damned problem. Is it me or are we getting kicked in the balls repeatedly? He said whilst looking over the ripped and damaged map that Zack was still staring at intently. From the back of the Land Rover, Max leaned forward, pointing out several of the locations to Zack.
We could stop here and do a quick check. Haven't seen any signs of the undead around here, he suggested.
That's a good idea. If only you were right.
Look, said Nick as he pointed out the side of the road. A small number of zombies were stumbling around near an upturned truck that was lying in a fragile state along the side of the highway.
Fuck,
swore Max.
Hey, easy now, fella. We'll work out a plan, said Zack, though his voice was far from convincing. The column of vehicles continued their slow progress along the road, though there seemed to be a marked change in the speed and risks they were now taking. Probably down to the very serious issue of damage and wear to the already worn-out vehicles. Experience had shown in the past that too much adrenaline and speed increases the risks of blowing out a tire or stalling an engine, and in this zombie-infested world, that usually meant one thing: zombie food. And that was something that they had all fought a long time to avoid. The familiar crackle of the radio signaled another plea from the rest of the convoy.
Okay, we done a quick look around and we just can't tell from inside here. We'll need to pull over soon, and if we don't, we might have to abandon the bus,
came back the reply. Nick paused for a second as he double-checked the map before turning to Zack. Well, he asked.
Seems pretty simple to me. We find a place and check out on the convoy. We can't afford any failures on the way. Remember Gloucester? He said with a grin.
Yeah, I'm trying to forget it, said sarcastic Nick as he grabbed for the mic.
Okay, listen up. We're working out a new route now. How many made it, and can you see how the rest of the convoy's doing? Asked Nick.
Again, there was a painful pause as the vehicles continued to limp along before the survivors on the bus could radio back.
No problems with the convoy yet, though I'm seeing a bit of smoke from behind one of the trucks, came the reply. Smoke? How bad? Asked Nick. I don't think it's serious. I think it's been doing it all the way, said the man.
Nick gave the map one last look before announcing his decision.
Okay, I've checked the route, and I think this is the best option under the circumstances. We come off the motorway in about 2 miles, and then take the main road that runs parallel with the motorway. It's at least 10 miles from the nearest town, and after 4 miles, it joins a dual carriageway until we meet back to the motorway. You think the small country roads are a good idea? Some of those are impassable. Don't forget we're talking 10 years of neglect.
Yeah, and we weren't up for much before all this happened, laughed Zack.
Nick clung to the steering wheel as they hit something in the road. It wasn't significant, but it did rock the vehicle and caused them to swerve off to the side.
Fuck!
Swore Nick, as he recovered their position before continuing his conversation on the radio.
It's not ideal, but we've used them on and off for the last 18 months, and if we take it easy, we should be okay. Anyway, the city's a no-go area. The last scout party we sent said the city was still teeming with the undead, and that isn't likely to have changed. More importantly, though, is what we do in the next 5 minutes. We need to check the vehicles and supply situation. There's no point in pushing on if half the vehicles is broken down in the next few miles," he said. The reply from the bus was almost instant. "No problem, ma'am. You never know, the old services on that road might even have some fuel. If nothing else, it's big, open, and flat, and won't be easy to sneak up on." "Okay, to the services it is," said Nick. He checked his mirrors, making sure the armored bus was still behind them. They now had just a mile to drive before hitting the exit. The old motorway used to carry 2 lanes of traffic in each direction, but now it was overgrown and full of plants and debris. Every few hundred yards they drove past a rustling hulk of a long abandoned car or truck, and even those that looked reasonably intact had almost certainly been looted for anything of value. Fuel? Are they kidding? The service station is the obvious place for any survivor in the last 10 years. I doubt there's a single liter of stuff in the place," he said angrily. "Like it matters. We have enough fuel for the next few hours. Right now we just need to get off the road and check off the vehicles and our people. That was a close call at the castle, and we're lucky any of us made it out alive," said Nick. "True," said Zack, whilst looking out the passenger side window. At the side of the road a sign was covered in foliage, but it was just possible to make out the exit symbol on the top. Nick pulled on the intercom and hit the button. "We're coming off at this exit. Get your people ready. We need to form a lager. Remember how we practiced it?" "Roger," came back the one-word reply. The convoy continued its slow, methodical progress along the motorway as they swerved in and out of the debris and abandoned vehicles. The bus that followed Nick was heavily modified in terms of armored protection, though most of the modifications were worn or damaged as they hadn't been used for several years. Nearly all the windows were fitted with slats, and hinged metal flaps hung down low over the wheels. On top of the bus were several weapon positions where hatches had been cut into the roof and surrounded by a metal bar on which weapons were mounted. Behind the bus, another 3 vehicles followed, and each had modified in much the same fashion. A medium-sized ambulance was the next in line, and until the escape, it had been used as a rescue and medical vehicle. It was not equipped with weapons, but did have the best armored passenger area in the convoy, and in an emergency could operate as a panic room or safe area to hide in until help would come. The final 2 vehicles were a small van and a minibus. Both were lightly armored and used as light transports by the survivors. The van carried a single weapon mount on the roof, while the minibus had extra hatches, ladders, and fighting platforms so that it could be used as a raised platform for accessing buildings without having to get onto the ground. The lead Land Rover pulled off to the left as the convoy left the motorway and proceeded up the exit ramp onto the wide circular road that wound around and towards the service station. In the years before the outbreak, it had been a convenient place for drivers and passengers to rest and relax on a long journey, or to grab some food or fuel before they carried on. This time was different, though. The debris on the exit road was substantial, and Nick needed to work hard with the plow to force his way past the scrub and rubbish to reach the entry road to the service station. As the other vehicles struggled to follow, they could see down over the raised road surface to the motorway below them. About a quarter of a mile ahead into the distance, the road was blocked by a large number of vehicles, though whether this was by accident or design, they would never know. Inside the Land Rover, Nick changed down to the low box or the gearing to give him extra control and torque at low speeds. At a walking pace, he pushed past the debris and into the parking lot that was almost totally abandoned, save for 3 tankers
and a few burnt-out cars.
"Holy shit! You think there'll be any juice in them?" said a surprised Max.
"Somehow, I seriously doubt we could be that lucky and find 3 fully loaded tankers just sitting there waiting for us," replied Zack. Nick gave a restrained laugh as he pushed back into the high box with a clunk. Though the ground was overgrown, the debris was much less on the road. They pushed forwards towards the area outside the entrance to the station and about 50 yards from the tankers before coming to a halt. Before Nick even gave the order, Zack was climbing up and onto the roof of the cabin so that he could man the Bren gun. Nick kept the engine running and the lights on as the rest of the vehicles arrived. They formed up next to each other, but not too close, in case they needed to leave in a hurry. It was clear from the noises coming from the bus that it was suffering serious mechanical problems, and when the engine was switched off, it gave a sigh that almost sounded like relief. Doors banged as a dozen or so of the survivors left their vehicles and headed for the bus. All the group was armed, though only a few with firearms. The door on the bus opened to reveal a tall man in battered riot armor. It was Gary, the ex-police officer who had helped with the running battle to escape the town. He jumped down, followed by several others. Nick cut the engine on the Land Rover and jumped out. Max pulled out a machete and followed him as he headed for the group assembling next to the bus. The only sound other than a gentle breeze was the low mechanical sound of the 100-foot-tall wind turbine a few hundred yards away. Incredibly, it was still moving, though it sounded much less smooth than it had when installed 15 years earlier. A few dull lights flickered from parts of the station, presumably powered from the modest generator built into the wind turbine. "Hey, stay frosty. 3 shots in the air if you spot any trouble," he shouted before turning to the group. "We've got big trouble," said Peter, one of the Johnson brothers, as he scrambled out from under the bus.
"What is it?"
"Well, 3 things. First, we got an oil leak, a big one. Second, the engine mounts are going. I doubt they'll hold much longer."
"And the third?" asked Nick as he reached them.
"The third is, we only have a reserve tank with any fuel left in it. The main tank has a hole the size of my fist in it," said an exasperated Peter.
"Oh, man, that's fucking great," cried one of the passengers who started to pace back and forth.
"What are we going to do? Can we spread out between the trucks?" asked another.
"Good question," replied Gary as he looked about. "Any idea on how many made it out?" asked Nick. Jessica, a middle-aged woman with a very young child on her back, came forward with a list.
"We're checking on weapons and supplies, but I do have the numbers on people here."
She passed it to Nick and then moved so Gary could also read it.
36? Shit! Is that it?"
said Nick. Jessica nodded, saying nothing.
"Says here we have 2 wounded."
"How bad?"
"One has a broken arm, the other wounds to the leg and head. They're both still unconscious," she answered.
Max stepped forward, brandishing his machete.
"Wounded? Are either of 'em bitten? You know the rules, Jessica," he said firmly. "Hey, I just checked. We need to keep checking them over properly,"
she answered indignantly. Nick looked around the group. The vehicles were in a bad way, but the people looked even worse. He looked towards the tankers and the service station whilst formulating his plan.
"Okay. We have about 3 hours before it gets light. I suggest we secure the parking area, service station until daylight. When we get some light, we'll reappraise the vehicles and work out a plan in the meantime. Before we can relax, though, we need to get this place under control." "I'll take a group and check over the tankers. You take the building," suggested Max. "Yeah. When we've secured the place, I'll send for you and the others,"
said Nick before moving over to Peter.
I need you to keep everybody else in the vehicles. Don't let anyone leave under any circumstances. When the building's secure, we'll come for you. Okay?
Peter nodded and moved back to the vehicles. Nick looked around the group, checking who was left and quickly assessing the best people to take. He selected 5 that he'd worked with before, and the group moved off to the entrance of the building. With such poor light, they had to make do with the 2 remaining torches. Nick was armed with a machete as well as a crossbow, whilst the rest carried a mixture of shields, axes, blades, and one cut-down musket that had more in common with a blunderbuss. The entrance to the service station was wide, and had originally contained 2 sets of swinging glass doors. Only one remained intact, however, as the other was in pieces on the floor. Long since destroyed, though whether it was people, zombies, or the weather, they couldn't tell. Nick stepped in first, his machete at the ready in case of danger. The others followed closely behind, each checking around them for signs of danger. It was not a large station, and the entrance led into a simple open hall that was like the center of a spoked wheel. Directly ahead was a large cafeteria, to the left a ransacked shop, and to the right a small coffee house. In the far right corner, a narrow hall led to a toilet area. Flickering lights came from the part of the building, and a dull orange glow came from the toilet area. Nick moved ahead toward the eating area, whilst signaling with his hand for the rest to follow. One thing they had learnt early was that you never, ever went anywhere alone. That was the way to get picked off, and also an easy way to get unknown bites and infections into the group. Experience showed that even though the living knew a bite meant death, they would almost always hide it, and this had grave concerns for the rest of the group. In the eating area, Nick stopped soon after entering and looked around. There was something odd about the place, and it took almost 30 seconds before he realized what it was. The place had been fortified, but even worse, it had fallen. The windows on the far side were boarded up, and along the counter were several boxes of shotgun shells and bottles of fluid. He moved a little closer before spotting the first of the bodies. He hand-signaled to the rest to stop as he knelt down to examine the decomposing body. It had been there for a few months, and showed signs of having been bothered by wildlife. More importantly than the body, though, was the clothing and equipment.
No way. There are scouts. They must have been trapped here, said Nick.
Adam, the man carrying the shield and mace, headed for the serving area to examine the weapons.
Yeah, this is definitely our gear. They must have raided the gun store or police station, though. We haven't seen this kind of firepower in a long time.
Nick pointed to a tear in the wall that led outside.
We'll get the others to take the bodies outside. Right now, though, we need to clear the place, he said.
Leaving the eating area, he returned back to the center of the building and moved towards the back hallway that led to the toilet area. In his experience, this is where people usually retreated, and it was often a dead end. In every sense of the word. As Nick turned the corner, he came face to face with a closed door. Most people would probably just open the door, but Nick had seen what happened when people made a foolish decision like that. He held his blade firmly in his right hand, whilst gently pushing the door forwards. As it opened, a bloodied hand pushed out, catching the door frame and pulling the door wide open. 2 ragged creatures stumbled out from the area with their jaws open, their intent clear. Without pausing, Nick lifted up his machete, delivering a swift slash that cut the first in the throat and opened into its brain. Adam jumped forward, smashing his shield into the second and forcing it back into the toilet area. Anton, a lightly built man in his 20s, tried to assist, but couldn't get past Adam, who kept driving forwards with the shield. He didn't stop until he had the zombie up against the wall.
Nick jumped in, followed by Anton, and they proceeded to stab and cut at the creature until its hacked body fell in a mush to the floor. The three stood there, panting as they looked around. The toilet area was hardly pretty, though the fact that the entrance featured a spring-loaded door meant that wildlife hadn't found its way in yet. The room wasn't large, though it stank from standing water, and there appeared to be no running water. Adam carefully kicked each door open to check on any potential problems in the cubicles. It took only a short time, but the situation was tense until the place could be confirmed as clear. Once he'd checked the last section, he turned back to the group. "Yeah, all clear now," he said. Nick signaled for him to follow him as they headed back into the center area. There was no need to check the shop. It was small and had been ransacked to the level that even the shelving had been stripped. As the group headed for the door, they glanced inside the old coffee shop. As with the shop, it had been well ransacked and nothing of note remained. They moved for the door, but before they could leave, Adam spotted something glinting in the corner of the coffee area. "Hey, you see that?" he asked as he moved slowly towards the object. As he got closer, he flicked on the torch that lit up the corner and a blocked-off doorway with streaks of blood on the wall and floor. "Fuck!" swore Adam as he dropped the shield into position, expecting an attack at any moment. Nick joined him whilst the others stayed a short distance behind to watch their backs. "I don't know how I missed that," said Nick as they crept inside. The corridor was narrow and obviously not designed for the public. One narrow light flickered occasionally, providing minimal lighting, but enough to make it seem the last place they wanted to head down. As they reached the end, they came to two doors. One was signed as manager, the other storeroom. Nick moved up to the first door and Adam to the second. Nick signaled for Adam to wait as he placed his hand on the handle and ever so gently pulled on it. The door unlocked, but try as he might, would not open. "Must be locked from the inside," said Adam, who then tried the same with his door. With little effort, it swung open to reveal an almost pristine office with only a few items knocked over. After giving the room a quick once-over, the two returned to the locked door. "Wait a sec, I've got an idea." He lifted his hand and knocked several times. "Anybody home?" he asked. Adam gave him a whimsical look, but to the shock of the two men, a sound came from inside. "What the fuck was that?" asked Adam as he took a step back from the door. Nick shrugged and tried the door again. As he pulled the handle, there was a clicking sound, and the door swung open to reveal a dark, damp room that was packed with stores and two people. The closest was a middle-aged man dressed in rough clothing and carrying what looked like a car piston. The other person was a young child, perhaps 8 or 9, and she was hiding behind a cupboard, but also carrying a weapon of some kind. The man coughed as he cleared his throat. "You're not one of them," he groaned. Nick lowered his machete. "You're okay. We're here to help with other people. How long you been here?" "Just over a month. We were coming back with a convoy. We've been trapped here ever since." "Is there anybody else left?" The man turned his head. "The last few tried to get away in cars. We've been waiting for help since then. Are you here for us?" he asked with a pleading look in his eyes. Adam stepped forward, looking inside the room. The young girl raised her weapon before the man beckoned for her to lower it. "We're evacuating a green zone. Have you heard of it?" he asked. "Green zone?" sighed the man. "That's where we were heading." "Yeah, well, It's gone now. We need to find somewhere new," said Nick. As they continued talking, Nick had a look around the room and was astounded at the amount of supplies and equipment in such a small place, as well as bottles of water. He could see clothing, a modest amount of medical supplies, plus a motley selection of weapons and ammunition. "Where did you get all this stuff?" "The group we were with had been collecting all this for months, ready for a push to you guys." "Such a waste." "Hardly. We can use this," said Adam with a smile. The man looked back, presumably to his daughter, before turning to Nick. "If you'll take us with you, then you'll be more than welcome to help yourself to what we have," he offered. Nick smiled. "You must come with us. Come on," he beckoned. The little group left the room and headed back to the open part of the building where the others waited for them. "We've got a few survivors, and even better, some supplies. Get the rest in here. We need to fortify the perimeter and then get rest for tomorrow," said Nick. Anton stepped forward and shook the man's hand before rushing off to the vehicles outside to give them the news. Nick and the others returned to the eating area and cleared space to lay out equipment and blankets to sleep on. As the first of the passengers entered the building, Nick and Adam helped direct them to block the entrances, remove the bodies, and start sorting out through the supplies. Gary and Max entered, carrying weapons and the map. "This is the first bit of luck we've had, well, in the last 24 hours, said Max. "True," replied Nick. "But we need a few hours to rest before daybreak. Gary, you can organize shifts for security. I want everybody in this one room. Nobody goes wandering about. As soon as light hits, we need a full assessment of the vehicles. In the meantime, let's check the wounded and the food situation." They had the place cleared and relatively safe in under an hour. Most of the passengers were already sleeping, or at the very least lying down and resting. For all of them, this was the first break in an almost unbroken 48 hours of fighting and running.
Chapter 9. Lundy Island, England. Dave, Tommy, and Steve had made quick progress across the island, and the church was in sight a half-mile ahead. They'd kept up a fast pace, hoping to reach the town before the creatures did, but also knowing that they needed to conserve as much energy as possible. Dave came to a stop as he could finally see the horde surrounding the big stone structure. "Fuck, fuck, fuck!" he shouted. "Holy shit, this isn't good," said Tommy. "But there must be some survivors in the church, Dave," said Steve. "Yeah, but they had no warning. The fact that the bells went off half an hour ago suggests they only knew about the creatures once the town was already overrun, so I doubt there are many left." "What do we do, Dave?" asked Tommy. "We need to clear those bastards from the church, so we have at least some kind of idea who's left and what we can do." "How much ammo do we have?" asked Steve. "I've got 8 shells on me," said Dave. 6, said Tommy. "Christ, and I have 7 arrows. That's not exactly ideal." "No, let's keep going. We'll just have to wing it," said Dave. The men again got up to a steady jogging pace towards the church, but before they had been running for long, gunshots rang out from the church, but they didn't stop to discuss it. "Christ, it's already begun. Let's move," shouted Dave. The revolvers and Glock rang out until every shot was gone. 10 zombies lay dead in the entrance to the church, whilst more creatures poured through the gap. Roger threw down his pistol and held the sawn-off double-barreled shotgun in both hands. The first shot obliterated the closest target, the second dropping another.
He quickly snapped open the barrel to reload as Derek and Katie laid into the creatures with their hand weapons. Another 2 beasts fell from the axe and hammer. Roger locked the shotgun closed again. "Out of the way!" shouted Roger. He held up the shotgun, firing off the 2 rounds in quick succession. The first ripped half the face off a zombie, but didn't stop it. He had to use the second shot on the same creature to finish it. He desperately reloaded the last shell he had as his comrades smashed away. "This is the last one!" screamed Roger in desperation. He held up the shotgun, seeing his friends were already beginning to tire from the combat. The round went off, bursting open the skull of his nearest foe. Roger's face turned to stone as the realization set in that they were still facing massive numbers. Derek's axe struck into the skull of a creature and embedded so deep it got stuck. Before he could recover it, another creature took hold of him and bit hard into his arm, another into his neck, before Katie could hit back. Behind the horde, 2 guns fired off in surprise. "Hey, motherfuckers!" shouted Tommy. Relief set in for Roger as the familiar sound of his friends rang out. Much of the horde turned its attention to the field in front of the church, where the 3 men stood in the open ground. "Come get some!" shouted Dave. More of the creatures turned and began to walk over the 2 dead that Dave and Tommy had just shot. Steve loosed off an arrow from his bow, his days of practice showing. The steel-headed arrow penetrating the eye socket of a zombie, killing it instantly. Katie carried on, clubbing the few creatures to death that had stayed to fight them. Now, the whole horde's attention was focusing on this new threat. Katie stood over Derek, who was badly hurt, but still very much alive. "Don't let me become one of those bastards!" he cried. "I won't, my darling. I love you," said Katie. She lifted her club hammer with 2 hands and smashed it down on her partner's head, killing him instantly. Tears already streaked down her face, but her resolve to fight was only hardened. With the horde's attention turned, the exit into the open ground was now open. "Katie, let's move, now!" Roger shouted. He took up Derek's axe and ran out of the door with Katie. They immediately turned for the open ground and ran until they were safely away from the zombies. They looked back at their friends reloading their weapons. The horde was almost on top of them. "Dave, run!" Roger screamed. Dave looked around to see the 2 survivors fleeing from the church. He snapped his shotgun shut and reloaded it with his last 2 shells. "Let's go!" shouted Dave. The men ran towards Milcom House to join the others. They stopped as they reached them, now 50 feet clear of the horde, with just a minute to talk. "Anyone else left?" asked Dave. "Not that we know of," said Roger. "Christ, what a fucking disaster. What's the plan, Roger?" "You got much ammo left?" "Almost nothing," said Dave. "Then let's get to the house. We can't do anything without weapons." "Agreed. Let's go," shouted Dave. The 5 survivors ran towards the house, being the only humans left on the island. "Where did all these bastards come from, Dave?" Roger asked. "A fishing ship is beached on the coast up north. It must have been packed with the fuckers." "Jesus, I never thought it could happen," Roger replied. "No, none of us did. But I'll be damned if I'm going to die without a fight," shouted Dave. They reached the road to the house. The horde was stumbling towards them enthusiastically. They knew it wouldn't be long before it reached them. Looking down the hill towards the jetty, dozens of the creatures were staggering forwards. A single zombie stood in their path to the house. Dave stopped, lifted his shotgun, and blew its head off with the last round. "Jesus Christ! How many of them are there?" asked Roger.
A shitload. I can only imagine the ship was packed with the survivors who somehow got infected," said Dave. They ran to the door of the house and flung it open, went inside, and quickly shut it behind them.
"Upstairs, quickly! We need all the weapons we can get!"
shouted Roger. They stormed into the room where many of the weapons and ammunition were kept. They had 20 shotgun shells left, 12 9mm rounds for the Browning, 7 for the .45 Colt, and a selection of crossbows and bows.
"Jesus, Dave! I thought we were well stocked. Who could ever have imagined such a fight on our island?"
asked Roger. "No, we had no idea. Grab the bows and crossbows and get to the windows quickly. We'll use those first. Get firing as soon as they come within effective range. Save the firearms for when you really need them." He picked up the Colt with just one full magazine. Tommy and Roger each took 10 shotgun shells each, and everyone else grabbed a bow or crossbow. "Make sure you all have some hand weapons. We'll be out of ammo in no time," said Dave. Roger grabbed his beloved saber, and Katie hung